Hey friends, about 70% of folks watching my videos aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a like, leave a comment, and let me know where you're tuning in from. The scene reminded me of ransacked campsites I'd found in Oregon, but something seemed more chaotic, more frenzied here. My partner held up a stuffed giraffe, its fluffy brown neck marred by what looked like clog ashes. A chill ran up my spine. There were kids here, Jake said quietly. We both knew what that could mean. A family trip turned worst nightmare. I stood up, fighting a growing sense of unease. The forest had gone deathly quiet. No bird calls, no chattering of squirrels. Just then, an unearthly howl echoed from the darkening trees. A sound I'd never heard in all my years in the wilderness. Jake and I locked eyes as it faded into silence. We need to call this in now. I said, unclipping my radio from my belt. Something very wrong happened here. Under the light of a propane lamp, Jake and I pored over faded newspaper articles and historical records scattered across the rough wooden table of the ranger station. A tight knot had formed in my stomach as we pieced together a disturbing chronicle of this forest's history. Listen to this, Jake said, pointing to a yellowed clipping. August 1887, a fur-trapping expedition vanished without a trace near the Black River. The only sign found was a single half-eaten boot. He shook his head. And here, July 1902, 3 loggers disappeared from their camp, clothes found shredded by claws. I rubbed my temples. It gets worse. I found an account from 1849 of settlers' livestock turning up mutilated, drained of blood. Hello, friend. About 70% of those who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did. Also, don't forget to press the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you all. From which country or city do you follow the channel? The radio crackled as dispatch relayed the report. An abandoned campsite found by hikers deep in the national forest, signs of a disturbance. My partner Jake and I exchanged a glance as we pulled up the access road in our Forest Service truck. In my 10 years as a park ranger across 5 states, I'd seen my share of strange incidents, but something about this felt different from the start. Lengthening shadows stretched across the pine needle-strewn ground as we hiked the quarter-mile to the site. The normal chatter and whir of wildlife faded into an eerie stillness, broken only by the crunch of our boots and the occasional distant screech of a hawk. We emerged into a small clearing to find a scene of disarray. 2 tents half collapsed, the rain flies torn and flapping in the breeze overturned camp chairs, and a blackened fire pit full of ash. Jake surveyed the scene, hands on his hips. What do you make of this, Ethan? I knelt down, examining a shredded backpack. Its contents were strewn across the dirt. A topographical map, granola bar wrappers, a crushed water filter, perhaps cougar tracks. I frowned at some unidentifiable marks in the soil. The Ojibwe tribes here had stories about creatures that could mimic the appearance of animals and of men. The discoveries lined up too neatly with what we'd seen, the signs of attack, the eerie feeling of being watched in those woods. I flipped through a book on native folklore, suppressing a shiver at the detailed drawings of hollow-eyed beasts walking on 2 legs and 4. The elders warned about those who walk like them. I knew allowed beings that could shift their form, hunting in the twilight hours. I glanced up at Jake. You all think those stories could be true? Jake looked uneasy. He was silent for a long moment. I don't know what to think anymore, but I know I've got a bad feeling about those woods, like something in there is watching, waiting. I stared out the dark window to the moonlit trees beyond. A howl from the forest seemed to echo in my mind. For the first time in my career, I felt the icy grip of real fear clenching in my gut, a primal instinct telling me there were things lurking in that wilderness that defied explanation or logic. Ancient things, hungry things, and they knew we were coming. Gray light filtered through the pine boughs as Jake and I set out at dawn, our breath puffing in the chill morning air. We'd radioed for backup, but with a remote location, it would be another day until a search team could reach us. Every hour counted for any survivors still out there. We pressed deeper into the backcountry, following faint game trails through the dense understory. Despite the brightening day, the shadows felt thick and watchful. My neck prickled at every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. Jake was on edge too, his hand never straying far from the bear spray on his belt. At first, the forest seemed deceptively peaceful, but soon signs of violence appeared with unsettling frequency. A sapling snapped in two, its bark scored by claw gouges on an old-growth spruce. The remains of a fawn ripped to pieces and scattered. This was beyond the work of any bear or mountain lion. Our radio crackled with static each time we tried to make contact. The signal was blocked by dense foliage or unseen interference. As we lost our lifeline to the outside world, a sense of isolation began to weigh on us. How many miles of wilderness stretched in every direction? I tried to force down the growing fear as my imagination ran wild. Bounding shapes seemed to flicker at the corners of my vision, there and gone when I turned to look. Low noises echoed from beyond the tree line, guttural and inhuman. Whatever was out there, it seemed to be circling, as if hurting us deeper. It was nearly dusk when we stumbled across the first real evidence, a torn shirt snagged on a briar, with dark stains splashed across the fabric, a broken camera, its lens shattered, and a single hiking boot with slashes marring the sturdy leather. Jake held up a hand. Suddenly his posture was rigid, with alertness. In the stillness I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Rapid footfalls crackling through the underbrush, harsh breathing and snapping twigs. The unmistakable sound of something large giving chase, and it was coming our way. Heart pounding, Jake and I plunged headlong through the darkening forest, thorny branches whipping in our faces. Some primal instinct had overtaken us, a single imperative to flee, overpowering all rational thought. Behind us, the noises of pursuit grew louder, heavy paws thudding against the forest floor. My lungs burned as I pushed myself faster, leaping over fallen logs. Jake risked a glance over his shoulder, his eyes widened with raw terror. "Don't look back," I yelled, but it was too late. He stumbled hard and went down. I skidded to a stop several yards ahead as he scrambled back to his feet and staggered forward. In the fading light, I caught a glimpse of something huge and dark bounding between the trees behind him, a flash of shaggy fur and glowing eyes. We crashed blindly through a dense briar thicket. Thorns shredded our uniforms. The creature's snarls echoed just out of sight, spurring us on. As the last of the daylight faded, we burst out of the underbrush and found ourselves in a narrow, fog-shrouded valley. Towering limestone bluffs reared up on either side, their faces were pitted with dark openings. Ahead, the beam of my flashlight picked out a yawning cave mouth. With no time to weigh options and our pursuers crashing through the brush behind us, we clambered inside. A bank of damp earth and rotting organic matter filled my nostrils as we pressed ourselves against the clammy rock walls, trying to quiet our ragged breathing. Outside, the crunching footsteps slowed. Snuffling animalistic sounds echoed from mere yards away. Trembling, I raised my light and played it over the cave interior. My heart nearly stopped. The walls were covered with deep claw marks, cross-hatched gouges in the stone stretching far back into the gloom. Scattered across the floor were bits of faded fabric, broken leather, shreds of clothing. The beam settled on something that made bile rise in my throat. A human skeleton, its limbs splayed, with bits of flesh still clinging to the exposed bones. Beside it, the warped plastic of a child's toy. The soft whimper came from the darkness deeper within the cave. I shared a shocked look with Jake. As I swept the light towards the sound, it glinted off a pair of wide, terrified eyes. A group of filthy, bedraggled people in tattered clothing cowered against the back wall. Tire tracks cut through the grime on their faces. "Help us," croaked a woman, her voice hoarse with fear. "Please, God, help us." From outside the cave, a low growl rumbled and was answered by another and another. I don't know how long we huddled against the slick cave walls, listening to the sounds of pacing footsteps and guttural noises from outside the entrance. Time lost all meaning in the darkness, minutes stretching into hours. My muscles ached from tension, my stomach was knotted so tightly that I felt nauseous. The survivors were in a state of shock, trembling and wide-eyed. Between fits of weeping and fractured accounts, Jake and I pieced together that they were the Paulson family: mom, dad, teenage son, and young daughter. They'd been out here for 4 days and 3 nights, ever since the first attack on their campsite drove them to flee into the woods. Since then, they'd been relentlessly pursued and harassed by the creatures. "It hurted us," whispered the father, his haunted gaze fixed on some distant horror, toyed with us, picked us off one by one. "The things we've seen," his face crumpled. Despite my training, I had no response, no words of reassurance. I felt as helplessly lost as the survivors looked. The barbaric grunts and snarls from outside had faded, but the silence brought no comfort. Instead, it brought a ratcheting sense of dread. In the heavy stillness, every drip of water from the cave roof made me flinch. "We need to make a run for it," Jake said in a strained undertone. "Try to reach the trail and get these people to safety." I met his eyes and saw my own desperation reflected there. "What choice did we have?" We gathered the Paulsons, urging them to stay close. On a count of 3, we made our break, bursting from the cover of the cave into the fog-shrouded night. Immediately, the forest erupted with motion. Dark shapes bounded from the underbrush in a cacophony of howls and snarls. Pure adrenaline shot through my veins. I remember snatches, Jake yelling, claws swiping inches from my face. The creatures moved too fast for the eye to follow, shadowy blurs with burning yellow eyes. Sheer terror drove me forward. Lung searing, I broke out of the trees into a clearing and whirled to a stop. Flashlight beams swept wildly. The Paulsons were with me, gasping for breath, but Jake was nowhere to be seen. I screamed his name until my voice went hoarse. The only reply was a long, chilling howl from the woods behind us. In that moment, the monstrousness of what hunted us sank in with sickening clarity. Tears streaked my face. I herded the shell-shocked family onward through the night. As the moon emerged from behind a cloud, its pale light picked out a hulking, dark form at the edge of the trees. The creature rose up on its hind legs, towering over 8 feet tall, matted fur slicked with blood, curved claws glinting, and eyes that glowed with a feral, otherworldly intelligence. I stared into the face of an impossible nightmare made flesh. The creature's lips curled back from jagged teeth in what almost looked like a grin, and then it dropped back to all fours and vanished into the forest. Exhausted and numb with shock, the Paulsons and I hiked through the night, clinging to the faint hope that we could reach the distant logging roads by dawn. The creature shadowed us, darting through the trees on either side, but never quite attacking, as if preferring to torment us, wearing us down bit by bit. When the fast gray lights seeped into the sky, they melted back into the forest, though I knew they were still out there watching, waiting. We stumbled upon an abandoned Forest Service cabin just as the adrenaline was fading and my legs were about to give out. The rustic structure looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but its sturdy log walls and tin roof offered some modicum of shelter. Ushering the family inside, I barricaded the doors and shuttered the windows. As I caught my breath, I surveyed the dusty cobweb interior and my heart skipped a beat. Hanging on the walls were tattered backpacks, shredded clothing, broken bits of camping gear, relics of past victims. Among the debris, a faded leather-bound journal caught my eye. Hands shaking, I flipped it open. The yellowed pages were filled with cramped, frantic writing that grew increasingly unhinged. Descriptions of the same creatures, the same horrors we'd witnessed. The final entry, dated 1962, sent chills down my spine. Not unlike any animal, too cunning, too calculated in their malice. As if some diabolical intelligence drives them. God help us all. I stared at those words and they kept echoing in my ears. Diabolical intelligence. The pieces began to connect in my mind, the elaborate stalking, the way the creatures seemed to savor our terror. This wasn't just animal instinct. There was a cold, grasping hunger in those glowing eyes that spoke of something far more sinister. A soft, keening wail interrupted my spiraling thoughts. In the corner, the teenage boy rocked back and forth, hands pressed over his ears. The parents were glazed and unresponsive. They'd been pushed to the brink of sanity, and I could feel my own mind starting to fray. The journal made reference to a network of old mining tunnels in the valley, places where past survivors had found temporary refuge. It was a desperate long shot, but if we could somehow reach them, we might be able to wait out the search parties. Peering out through a gap in the boards over the windows, my fragile hopes shattered. Dark forms moved through the trees, not one or two, but a whole pack. Slowly, deliberately, they circled the cabin low to the ground, their eyes glinting with terrible intent. There would be no escape. A soft screeching sound came from the walls, claws on wood shuddering. I backed away, pulling the Polsons close. The girl began to sob. My mind reeled, unable to process the sheer wrongness, the nightmarish unreality of what was happening. And then the front door burst inward with a splintering crash. Chapter 7. Primal Terror. In a heartbeat, the cabin erupted into chaos. Huge, shaggy forms surged through the doorway, eyes blazing, jaws slavering. Primal terror obliterated all rational thought. I remember snatching up a wood axe and swinging wildly. Inhuman shrieks and roars deafened me. The mother's high-pitched scream cut off abruptly. Claws raked across my back, sending me sprawling. I mauled and sprang up, slashing with the axe. It struck something solid, and a creature howled. Dark blood sprayed the walls. The Polsons scattered in panic, the father dragging his son toward the back of the cabin. With a splintering crash, creatures burst through the rear windows in a hurricane of wooden shards and thrashing limbs. The cabin was a whirlwind of snarling bodies, flashing teeth and blood-matted fur. Talons ripped into my arms, a white-hot agony. I hacked and fought like a man possessed. A small form crumpled to the floor beside me, and I glimpsed the girl's lifeless eyes. Every nightmare I'd ever had paled in comparison to the sheer wrongness of seeing these hulking brutes walk upright, gripped with almost human hands. Their eyes held a feral, sadistic glee as they tore into flesh. It was as if some malevolent force had taken the form of beasts to visit torment on humanity. With a roar, I lunged and buried the axe in a creature's chest. It shrieked and fell back, writhing. I staggered toward the Polsons, screaming at them to run. The boy was on his knees, his face white with shock beside the mangled remains of his father. His mother yanked him up, and we fled headlong into the blood-splattered morning. We crashed heedlessly through the trees, chased by howls that sounded in every direction. My muscles burned, my wounds ached, but sheer adrenaline kept me in motion. The boy sobbed with terror as his mother half-dragged him along. I had no idea where we were going. That to stop would mean a swift and brutal end. Finally, we broke out of the tree line and found ourselves on a precipitous bluff. Far below, whitewater rapids churned through a narrow gorge. With the creatures crashing through the forest behind us, we had only one option. Clasping hands, we jumped. The shock of the icy water knocked the breath from my lungs. I kicked against the current frantically, trying to keep the Polsons' heads above the surface as we were swept downstream. The roar of the rapids filled my ears. By some miracle, we managed to catch hold of an outcropping of rock and haul ourselves onto the narrow bank, gasping and shivering. Dizzy with pain and exhaustion, I looked back at the forest. Several dark forms paced at the edge of the trees, but they made no move to follow. For a fleeting instant, I nearly collapsed in relief until a chilling realization crept over me. They weren't pursuing because they didn't need to. Sooner or later, we have to return to the woods, and they would be waiting. I sat out at the rain-streaked window of the ranger station, watching the wind-swept forest that had become my own personal hell. It had been 2 weeks since the search teams found me stumbling down a logging road, delirious and half dead from my injuries. The shells shocked, Paulson's in tow. We were the only ones who made it out of those woods alive. In the end, official reports blamed a rogue bear for the attacks. The savage bodies and abandoned campsites were explained away. After all, who would believe the mad tale of a traumatized ranger and a family driven to the brink of sanity? I might have doubted it myself if not for the scars I bore, external and internal. The nightmares that jolted me awake in a cold sweat each night, my heart stuttering as I watched my friends and innocent people ripped apart. I want the truth, even if the rest of the world refused to see it. I'd witnessed the depths of malice in those glowing eyes, felt the unnatural strength in those grasping claws. The creatures had hunted us not just for food, but to inspire terror, to shatter minds. Questions haunted me. What were they? Some ancient evil that had always lurked in the depths of the wilderness as old legends told, or something new and unnatural twisted into being by forces I couldn't begin to comprehend, and not knowing nagged at me. Deep down I sensed that this was only the beginning. Those who had fallen prey to the beasts couldn't have been the first and wouldn't be the last. The journal's tales of disappearances stretched back decades. How many other dark forests concealed horrors beyond imagining, just waiting to draw in the unwary? I had one thing for certain, my life as a ranger was over. How could I send campers and families into parklands that I knew might be stalked by nightmares made flesh? Yet I couldn't rest until I found answers and made sure those creatures never claimed another victim. Slipping my badge and gun into a drawer, I took a last look around the ranger station that had been my second home for so many years. Then, shouldering my pack, I stepped out into the waiting night. The light rain fell as I turned my back on the forest and headed for my truck. Somewhere out there in the darkness, I knew they were still prowling, still hungry. But this time, the hunter would become the hunted. I've always preferred the quiet of the wilderness over the chaos of the city, but I guess that makes sense when you've spent most of your life working as a park ranger. Back in 2007, I was stationed in the Allegheny National Forest up in Pennsylvania. My name's Dominic Hollow, and by then I had 10 years on the job, with most of that time spent dealing with everything from lost hikers to injured wildlife. But what happened on that cold September day is the one thing I still can't shake, no matter how hard I try. That morning, I was out checking the more remote trails near the southeast corner of the forest, the kind of trails that only the most experienced hikers venture out on. The kind where if you make a wrong turn, you might just end up as a permanent part of the scenery. I had already radioed back to headquarters, letting them know I'd be out of range for a while, and that if I didn't check in by 5 p.m., they should send someone to check on me. You'd think that, after all those years working in a forest where black bears and wolves are still around, I'd have carried a weapon. But no, never needed one, I figured. I had my wits, and those had got me out of enough tight spots. The trail I was on was narrow, barely more than a path cut through the underbrush. The early autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. It was the kind of peaceful morning that made you forget the world existed beyond these ancient trees. I had been walking for about 3 hours, the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the trail lulling me into a meditative state, when I realized I hadn't seen a single soul. No hikers, no campers, not even the usual wildlife I'd come to expect in this part of the forest. The birds had gone silent, and even the ever-present buzz of insects seemed muted. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I saw something strange on the ground ahead of me. At first I thought it was just a pile of leaves, perhaps blown into an odd shape by the wind. But as I got closer, I realized it was a shredded tent. The nylon was torn apart, the metal poles bent like someone had taken a hammer to them. It looked like it had been through a shredder, the kind of damage that no animal I knew of could inflict. There were no signs of a fire, no backpacks, nothing that suggested the people who set up camp here had left on their own terms. A chill ran down my spine as I surveyed the scene, trying to piece together what could have happened. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who jumps to conclusions, but I'm also not blind to the possibility that people can do terrible things out in the woods. I figured maybe I'd stumbled upon a robbery or worse. I radioed it in, but as expected, the signal was too weak to get through. Static crackled in response to my words, the only sound in the unnaturally silent forest. I had no choice but to push on and try to find some clue as to what had happened here. The trail kept going deeper, winding into a dense part of the forest where the canopy blocked out most of the light. The trees here were old, their trunks thick and gnarled, their roots twisting across the path like grasping fingers. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a whiff of something sour and unpleasant carried on the breeze. In my line of work, that usually means an animal has been taken down by predators or hit by a car and wandered off to die. But the farther I walked, the stronger it got, and it wasn't the kind of decay I'd encountered before. This was something else, something that made my stomach turn and my skin crawl. Ahead, through the tangle of underbrush, I could see a clearing. A strange thing to find this far into the wilderness. It wasn't a natural meadow or glade, but rather a space that looked like it had been torn out of the forest by force. The ground had been churned up, trees were snapped at their trunks, and in the middle of it all, a mound of dirt covered with flies was piled higher than my head. And there, sticking out of the dirt, was a foot, pale, lifeless, and unmistakably human. I've seen dead bodies before. It's an unfortunate reality of being a park ranger. Sometimes people get lost, hurt, or caught in bad weather and don't make it out. But this was different. This wasn't a hiker who had taken a wrong turn or a camper who had met with an accident. The scene in front of me spoke of something far more sinister. My first instinct was to run to get as far away from this place as I could and not look back. But I knew I couldn't do that. As a ranger, it was my duty to investigate, to try and piece together what had happened here, no matter how much my gut was telling me to leave it alone. I pulled out my knife and started digging. The heavy stench of decay grew stronger with each shovel full of dirt. Whoever was under that pile was clearly dead. But something told me I needed to see the whole picture to understand the full extent of what had taken place in this remote corner of the forest. I had cleared about half the mound when I uncovered a face, eyes wide, open mouth, frozen in a silent scream. It was a young man, probably in his early 20s, his features distorted by fear and something else I couldn't quite place. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and marked with strange dark bruises that didn't look like any injury I'd ever seen. This was no animal attack. This was something worse, something that had left this man terrified in his final moments. Before I could even begin to process what I was looking at, I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound like something large breathing slowly, the kind of sound you feel more than hear. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. I froze every muscle in my body, tensing as I strained to listen. The forest had gone deathly silent. Even the flies that had been buzzing around the corpse seemed to have vanished. Then the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a primal response to a danger I couldn't yet see. A shadow passed over me from behind, something huge and dark, blocking out the sun for a brief moment. I could feel its presence, a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. Slowly I turned my hand, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. And that's when I saw it. It was hunched over, standing on two legs, but it was far too big to be human. Its form was more like that of a bear, but even that comparison fell short. The creature's body was covered in what looked like matted fur, dark and thick, clumped together in a way that suggested it had never been groomed. But it was its face that truly sent a wave of terror through me. It was wrong. A twisted amalgamation of features that didn't belong together. Its snout was elongated like a wolf's, but wider, filled with jagged teeth, some of which were too long to fit inside its mouth. They gleamed in the dappled sunlight, sharp and stained with something dark. I couldn't see its eyes, hidden deep within folds of fur and shadow, but I didn't need to. I could feel its gaze upon me, heavy and malevolent. It mattered exactly what I was and what I had discovered. In that moment, I knew I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. A creature born of nightmares and dark legends. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this place and never look back. I've never been much for heroics, and at that moment I sure as hell wasn't gonna start. Survival was the only thing that mattered. I turned and ran, adrenaline pumping through my veins, fueling my muscles as I crashed through the underbrush. I ran full tilt as fast as I could back towards the trail and the safety of civilization. Behind me I could hear the creature giving chase, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground, snapping branches and crushing vegetation as if it were nothing. It moved with a speed that belied its size, gaining ground no matter how fast I pushed myself. My lungs burned, my heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't dare slow down. I knew with certainty that if this thing caught me, I would meet the same fate as the poor soul buried in that clearing. In that moment, death snapping at my heels, I prayed for a miracle, some way out of this nightmare. Little did I know, my prayers were about to be answered, but not in the way I expected. My legs pumped, propelling me forward through the dense underbrush, heedless of branches whipping at my face and arms. The ground was treacherous, littered with hidden roots and loose rocks that threatened to send me sprawling with every step. But I didn't dare slow down, not with the sound of the creature's pursuit growing ever louder behind me. It crashed through the forest with a terrifying single-mindedness, its powerful body smashing through obstacles that would have stopped a lesser beast. I could hear the snap of trees being felled, the crunch of undergrowth being trampled, and over it all, the heavy, rasping breath of a predator on the hunt. My mind raced as I fled, desperately trying to come up with a plan, some way to escape this nightmare. I knew these woods had worn their trails countless times, but in that moment, everything looked alien, twisted by fear and adrenaline. Just as I felt my strength beginning to flag, my lungs burning and my legs turning to lead, I saw something that sparked a flicker of hope in my chest. Through the trees, barely visible in the green gloom, was the weathered outline of an old ranger's cabin. It was a relic from a bygone era, a time when the Forest Service maintained a more constant presence in these woods. I knew it had been abandoned for years, left to slowly decay as budgets were cut and priorities shifted. But in that moment it looked like salvation. I veered off the trail, my boots sliding on the loose leaf litter as I made a beeline for the cabin. The creature let out a roar behind me, a sound that seemed to shake the very trees, but I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. The cabin's door was barely hanging on its hinges. The wood warped and splintered by years of exposure to the elements. I hit it at a full run, throwing my shoulder against it with all my might. It gave way with a crack and I stumbled inside, nearly losing my footing on the rotten floorboards. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick, with the scent of mold and decay. But I hardly noticed my attention immediately drawn to the far wall where an old rusted rifle leaned in a corner, almost hidden by cobwebs and dust. I lunged for it, my hand shaking as I snatched it up, praying that it was still functional. It was a bolt-action model, ancient but sturdy, the kind of weapon that had served rangers well for generations. I quickly checked the chamber, my heart leaping as I saw the dull gleam of brass. It was loaded. No sooner had I made this discovery than a heavy thud shook the cabin. The creature had reached the door, its massive bulk blocking out the light as it tried to force its way inside. The frame groaned under the assault, the hinges straining as they fought to hold fast. I raised the rifle to my shoulder, my hand steadying as I took aim at the door. I knew I would likely only have one shot, one chance to stop this thing before it got to me. I had to make it count. The door burst inward, exploding into splinters as the creature charged through. In that instant, I got my first clear look at it, and the sight nearly made me drop the gun in shock. It was even more horrifying up close. Its body, a massive corded muscle under matted fur. Its face, a nightmarish fusion of man and beast. Its eyes, now visible, glowed with a feral, malevolent intelligence, fixing upon me with a hunger that went beyond the physical. I fired the rifle's report, deafening in the confined space. The recoil slammed into my shoulder, nearly knocking me off my feet. But I held my ground, watching as the heavy caliber round struck the creature in the chest. It staggered back, a howl of pain and rage tearing from its throat. Dark, viscous blood welled from the wound, staining its fur and dripping to the floor. But it didn't fall, didn't die, like I had hoped. Instead, it seemed only to be enraged, its eyes blazing with a fury that bordered on madness. It lashed out, its claws ripping through the air, shredding what remained of the door and frame round it. I stumbled back frantically, working the bolt on the rifle, trying to chamber another round, but I was too slow, too clumsy in my fear. The creature lunged its jaws wide, aiming for my throat. In my moment, I knew I was going to die, torn apart by this abomination in the depths of the forest I had once called home. I closed my eyes, waiting for the feel of teeth on flesh, for the agony of my life being ripped away. But the end didn't come. Instead, there was a flash of light bright even through my closed eyelids, and a sound like the very air being torn apart, and then silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the thundering of my heart. I opened my eyes, blinking against the sudden brightness that filled the cabin. For a moment, I thought I must be dead, that this was the afterlife I had never really believed in. But as my vision cleared, I realized I was still very much alive and that I was not alone. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the light, was a figure. At first I thought it was another creature come to finish what the first had started, but as he stepped forward I saw that it was a man, tall and lean, dressed in a way that seemed oddly out of place in the rustic setting of the cabin. He wore a long dark coat, kind that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Victorian novel. His face was angular, his skin pale, and his eyes were a piercing blue, so bright they almost seemed to glow in the dimness of the cabin. Well, that was a close one, wasn't it? He said, his voice smooth and cultured, with a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. "You're lucky, I was passing by." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. "Who? What?" I stammered, my voice rough and shaky. The man smiled, a gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes. "My name is Alistair," he said. "And as for what I am, well, let's just say I'm someone who has a vested interest in the goings-on in these woods." He stepped further into the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the interior before settling on the creature's body, which lay in a crumpled heap near the door. "I see you've met one of the local residents," he said, his tone almost conversational. "Nasty bit of work, that one. It's been causing trouble for a while now." I finally found my voice, the shock of the moment giving way to a surge of anger and confusion. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the rifle. "What was that thing? And who are you really?" Alistair held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Easy there, Ranger," he said. "I'm on your side. As for what that thing was, well, it's a bit of a long story. Suffice it to say, it's not from around here." Not from anywhere on Earth, really. My mind reeled at his words. Not from Earth. What was he talking about? But before I could voice my questions, he continued. There are things in this universe, Dominic, that most people never see, never even dream of. Creatures and beings that exist on the fringes of reality, slipping in and out of our world like ghosts. That thing you just faced, it's one of them. But how? Why? I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. Why here? Why now? Alistair's smile faded, his expression turning serious. Because this place, these woods, they're special. There are certain spots on this planet, certain places where the barriers between worlds grow thin. The Allegheny Forest is one of them. And when those barriers weaken, things can slip through. Things like our friend here. He nudged the creature's body with the toe of his boot. A look of distaste on his face. Where of course it's not supposed to happen. There are safeguards in place, ways to keep the barriers strong, but something's changed. Something's weakening them, allowing more and more of these things to cross over. And I stared at Alistair, trying to wrap my mind around what he was saying. Creatures from other worlds, barriers between realities. It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, not the kind of thing you'd expect to hear from a stranger in the middle of the woods. I know it's a lot to take in, Alistair said, seeming to sense my confusion. But trust me, Dominic, this is very real and very dangerous. He knelt down beside the creature's body, examining it with a critical eye. This one's just a foot soldier, he murmured almost to himself. A scout sent to test the boundaries, but there will be more, bigger, stronger, smarter, and they won't stop until they've claimed this world for their own. A chill ran down my spine at his words. The thought of more creatures like this, of an invasion from some other reality, was almost too much to bear. But there was one thing I still didn't understand. Why me? I asked, my voice sounding small in the stillness of the cabin. Why did it come after me? Alistair stood dusting off his hands. Because you saw it, he said simply. You found the body it left behind. And for things like this, that's reason enough. He fixed me with a piercing look, his blue eyes seeming to bore into my soul. Which means, I'm afraid that you're in this now, whether you like it or not. They'll be coming for you, Dominic. And the only way to stay alive is to stay ahead of them. I felt a surge of panic at his words. A feeling of being trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. But what can I do? I asked, hating the tremor in my voice. Mr. Park Ranger, I'm not equipped to deal with things like this. Alistair's smile returned, but there was a hard edge to it now. That's where I come in, he said. I've been tracking these incursions for a long time, learning their patterns, their weaknesses, and I can teach you how to fight them, how to protect yourself and others. He extended a hand, his long fingers pale against the gloom of the cabin. But I can't do it alone. I need a partner, someone who knows these woods, knows the terrain, someone like you, Dominic. I hesitated, my mind spinning with the implications of what he was offering. To join him to fight these creatures, it was a path I had never imagined for myself. But what choice did I have? If what he said was true, then I was already a target, already in danger. Slowly I reached out, clasping his hand in my own. His skin was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so, but his grip was strong, confident. Okay, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm in, but I need to know more. I need to understand what we're up against. Alistair nodded, releasing my hand. Of course, and I'll tell you everything I know, but not here. Not now. It's not safe. He glanced at the door, at the splintered wreckage. That was all that remained of it. We need to move to find somewhere more secure, somewhere we can plan our next move. He turned back to me, his expression grave. But first, we need to deal with this. He gestured to the creature's body, to the dark blood that pooled around it. We can leave it here, can't risk someone else stumbling across it. I understood what he meant. The last thing we needed was more questions, more attention. But the thought of touching that thing, of moving it, it made my skin crawl, as if sensing my revulsion. Alistair laid a hand on my shoulder.
You'll handle it,
He said, "You just keep watch. Make sure nothing else comes sniffing around." I nodded, grateful for the reprieve. As Alistair set to work dragging the creature's body out of the cabin and into the woods, I stood guard at the door. The rifle held tight against my chest. My mind raced as I tried to process all that had happened, all that I had learned. Creatures from other worlds, barriers between realities. It was like something out of a nightmare. But it was real, all too real. And now, whether I liked it or not, I was a part of it. As I watched Alistair disappear into the trees, the creature's body slung over his shoulder, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had just taken a turn into the unknown. And that, whatever lay ahead, it would test me in ways I had never been tested before. But I also knew that I couldn't turn back, couldn't pretend. This hadn't happened. I was in this now for better or for worse. And with Alistair's help, maybe, just maybe, I stood a chance of surviving it. Alistair returned a short while later, his coat smeared with dark stains that I tried not to think about too closely. He had a grim set to his jaw, a look in his eyes that spoke of unpleasant necessities undertaken. "It's done," he said, simply wiping his hands on a scrap of cloth he pulled from his pocket. "But we can linger here. They'll send others once this one fails to report back. We need to be long gone before that happens." I nodded, understanding the urgency of the situation. "Where do we go?" I asked, my mind already racing ahead, trying to think of safe places and secure locations. Alistair considered for a moment, his eyes distant. "There's a place," he said, "at last, a safe house of sorts. It's not far from here, a couple of hours hike at most. We can regroup there, figure out our next steps." He looked at me, his gaze intense. "But before we go, there's something you need to understand, Dominic. Something crucial." I braced myself, sensing that whatever he was about to say, it wouldn't be good. "What is it?" I asked, my voice tight. "These creatures, these invaders, they're not just mindless beasts. They have intelligence, cunning, and they have a plan." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "They're not just here to hunt, kill. They're here to colonize, claim this world as their own." A chill ran through me at his words. The thought of these things, these nightmarish entities taking over the earth, was almost too horrifying to contemplate. "But why?" I managed. My voice sounded strained even to my own ears. "Why here? Why now?" Alistair shook his head. "I don't know." He admitted, "I'd been trying to piece it together for years, tracking their movements, studying their patterns. But there's still so much I don't understand. There's so much that doesn't make sense." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What I do know is that they're not going to stop, not until they've achieved their goal or until they're made to. And that's where we come in." I swallowed hard, the weight of the responsibility settling heavy on my shoulders. "How?" I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. "How do we stop them?" Alistair's smile was grim, devoid of humor. "We hunt them," he said simply. "We track them down one by one, and we eliminate them. We find our entry points, their crossing places, and we seal them off. We become the barrier, the line of defense between their world and ours." It sounded daunting, impossible. But looking at Alistair, seeing the determination in his eyes, the set of his jaw, I found myself believing that maybe, just maybe, it could be done. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Okay, let's do it. Let's find the safe house, and then we start hunting." Alistair nodded, a glint of approval in his eyes. "Good man," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "I knew you had it in you." With that, we set off, leaving the ruined cabin behind us. Alistair led the way, moving through the woods with a surety that spoke of long familiarity. I followed close behind the rifle, a comforting weight in my hands. As we hiked, Alistair filled me in on what he knew on the lore and the legend of these creatures. He spoke of ancient civilizations that had worshipped them as gods, of mystics and madmen who had sought to harness their power. He spoke of the signs, the portents that heralded their coming. Strange weather patterns, animal behavior, electromagnetic anomalies. It was a lot to take in, a lot to process. But with each step, each mile that passed beneath our feet, I felt my resolve hardening, my determination growing. I had been chosen for this, whether by fate or chance, and I would see it through no matter the cost. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, we finally reached our destination. The safe house was a small, nondescript cabin nestled in a clearing deep in the heart of the woods. It looked unremarkable, indistinguishable from any other hunting lodge or forestry outpost. But as Alistair ushered me inside, I realized that appearances could be deceiving. The cabin was equipped with an array of advanced technology, computers, surveillance gear, weapons that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, and it was clear that this was no ordinary hideout. "Welcome to base camp," Alistair said, his voice tinged with pride. "From here we plan, prepare, and then hunt." I looked around, taking it all in. It was a far cry from the quiet life of a park ranger, from the peace and solitude of the forest I had known. But as I met Alistair's gaze, saw the fire burning in his eyes, I knew there was no turning back. I was a hunter now, and my prey was the stuff of nightmares. The first few days at the safe house were a blur of activity, preparation, and planning. Alistair was a whirlwind, a force of nature seeming to subsist on little more than strong coffee and sheer determination. He drove me relentlessly, teaching me about the creatures we were facing, their habits, their weaknesses. He showed me how to use the equipment, weapons, how to track electromagnetic signatures, set traps and wards. It was grueling, exhausting work. But as the days turned into weeks, I found myself growing stronger, sharper. My senses seemed to heighten, my reflexes quickening. It was as if I were being honed, shaped into a weapon myself. And all the while, reports kept coming in. Sightings, incidents, disappearances. The creatures appeared to be growing bolder, more brazen in their incursions. Alistair grew increasingly grim with each new piece of information, his jaw setting in a hard line. "They're getting stronger," he said one evening, poring over a map spread out on the table, fattening themselves on their reality, bathing in the seams between worlds. "We need to act, and soon, before it's too late." I nodded, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "Where do we start?" I asked, my voice steady despite the churning in my gut. Alistair tapped a finger on the map and indicating a spot deep in the forest. "Here," he said. "There's been a rash of disappearances within the last month. Hikers, campers. I think it's a crossing point, a place where the barriers are thin." I swallowed hard, remembering my own encounter, the creature that had nearly ended my life. "When do we leave?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Lord Alistair said, his eyes glinting in the lamplight. "We'll meet the daylight. These things, they're stronger in the dark." I spent that night in restless preparation, checking and rechecking my gear, running through the drills Alistair had taught me. Sleep was a distant memory, my mind too, full of what lay ahead. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, we set out. The forest was quiet still, as if holding its breath. Even the birds seemed muted, their calls few and far between. We hiked in silence, Alistair leading the way with the surety of a bloodhound on a scent. I followed close behind, my senses straining for any hint of danger, any sign of the creatures. It was mid-morning when we found the first one, or rather when it found us. It came bursting out of the underbrush, all teeth and claws and snarling fury. I had a moment of pure frozen terror, my mind flashing back to that day in the cabin. But then my training kicked in, muscle memory taking over. I brought my weapon up, sighting down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out echoing through the trees, and the creature stumbled dark ichor spraying from the wound in its chest. But it didn't fall. With a roar that shook the ground, it charged, closing the distance between us in heartbeats. I fired again and again, tearing into its flesh. But still it came on unstoppable in its fury. And then Alistair was there, a blur of motion, his own weapon blazing. The creature reeled, staggering under the onslaught, and then it was down, twitching and writhing in the dirt. I stood over it, my chest heaving, my hands shaking as I held my gun. Alistair knelt beside the creature, studying it with a clinical eye. Juvenile, he pronounced, prodding it with the barrel of his gun. Probably a scout sent to test our defenses. He looked up at me, his expression grim. "There will be more," he said. "They know we're here now. They'll be coming." They come they did. Over the next hours, we battled a seemingly endless tide of creatures, each one more vicious, more cunning than the last. We fought until our ammunition ran low, until our muscles screamed with fatigue. But we held the line. Inch by bloody inch we drove them back, sealing the crossing point with a combination of ancient wards and advanced technology. By the time the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire, the forest was still once more. We stumbled back to the safe house, exhausted but triumphant. We'd won a victory, struck a blow against the invaders. But as we collapsed into our bunks, as I felt the pull of exhaustion dragging me down into sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the real war was yet to come. In the days that followed, we fell into a routine of sorts. We would venture out hunting the creatures, sealing the crossing points. We grew leaner, harder our skills sharpening with each encounter, but the creatures were learning. Now adapted to our tactics, grew keenier, more elusive. It became a game of cat and mouse, a deadly dance through the shadows of the forest. And all the while I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something somewhere was observing our every move, studying us, learning our weaknesses. It came to a head one night as we sat huddled around the table in the safe house, poring over maps and reports. Alistair had been growing more and more restless, more driven, pushing us harder and harder. "We're missing something," he muttered, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "There's a pattern here, a reason behind their movements. But I can't see it, can't grasp it." I stared at the map, at the red marks indicating sightings and counters. Then suddenly it clicked. The ley lines. I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "They're following the ley lines." Alistair's head snapped up, his eyes widening. Of course he breathed. "The lines of power, the ancient pathways. They're using them to navigate, to cross over." He turned to me, a fierce light in his eyes. "Dominic, this is it. This is the key. If we can map the ley lines, if we can predict where they'll cross next, we can be there waiting for them." I finished feeling a surge of excitement and purpose. We worked feverishly, cross-referencing old maps and new data, triangulating the points of power. And as the picture began to emerge, as the pattern became clear, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Alistair," I said, my voice hushed. "Look at us, the lines are all converging on one point." He leaned over the map, his brow furrowed, and then his face went pale, and his eyes widening in shock. "My God," he whispered, "it's the city, they're all leading to the city." We stared at each other, the implications sinking in. If the creatures were converging on the city, if they were planning a mass crossing, the devastation would be unimaginable. Millions of lives snuffed out in an instant. We have to stop them, I said, my voice shaking. We have to warn someone. Get help. But Alistair was already shaking his head. There's no time, he said grimly. And who would believe us? A pair of madmen ranting about monsters from another world. He stood with a look of grim determination on his face.
No, Dominic, this is on us.
We're the only ones who know, the only ones who can stop this. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. He was right. It was up to us. The fate of the world, of everything we knew and loved, rested in our hands. We geared up in silence, checking our weapons, our equipment. There was no need for words. We both knew what we had to do, the sacrifice we might be called upon to make. As we stepped out into the night, into the waiting forest, I paused, looking back at the safe house. It had been our home, our sanctuary for so long, but I'm all with a sinking certainty that we would never see it again. The journey to the city was a blur, a nightmare of shadow and fear. We moved like ghosts, slipping through the darkness, avoiding roads, towns. We couldn't risk being seen. We couldn't risk the creatures catching wind of our approach. As we drew closer to the city, the signs of their presence grew more and more apparent. Strange lights in the sky, eerie silences, a feeling of wrongness that permeated the very air. And then on the outskirts, we found the first bodies, humans torn and mangled, drained of life. The creatures were already here. They were already beginning their grim work. We tracked them through streets, alleyways, and abandoned buildings. They were everywhere and nowhere, slipping in and out of reality, leaving destruction in their wake. And at the center of it all, in the heart of the city, we found it. The nexus point, the place where all the ley lines converged. A swirling vortex of energy, raw primal power, and pouring out of it a tide of nightmares, creatures of every shape and size, every horror imaginable. They were coming, crossing over in waves and unstoppable flood. We fought. Oh God, how we fought. With every weapon, every tactic at our disposal. We burned them with fire, blasted them with bullets, cut them down with blades forged in ancient runes. But for every one we felled, 10 more took its place. We were being overwhelmed, drowning in a sea of tooth and claw and primal hate. And then, in a moment of pure desperation, Alistair turned to me. The vortex, he shouted over the din of battle. We have to close it. It's the only way. I looked at him, saw the determination and resolve in his eyes. And I knew what he was asking, what he was intending to do. Together, I said, gripping his hand. We do this together. We charged, heedless of the claws, the teeth, rending our flesh. We poured every last ounce of our strength, our will, into one final desperate assault. And as we reached the heart of the vortex, as we stood on the brink of oblivion, I saw Alistair smile. A sad smile. A smile of farewell. It's been an honor, he said, to fight beside you. And then I let go of my hand and stepped forward into the maelstrom. The explosion was unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. A blinding flash, a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. And then silence, stillness. I stood alone amidst the ruins, the ashes. The vortex was gone, sealed by Alistair's sacrifice. The creatures cut off from their source like dead and dying around me. It was over. We had won. But the cost? I don't remember much of what happened after. The cleanup, the cover-up. The world went on blissfully, unaware of how close it had come to the brink. I remember carrying the scars, the memories, the knowledge of what lurks in the shadows, waiting ever hungry. And sometimes in the night I dream. I dream of a figure standing tall amidst chaos. A figure with bright blue eyes and a sad, knowing smile. Alistair, my friend, my brother in arms, the man who saved the world and was lost to history. But I will remember. I will carry his story, his legacy, and I will continue the fight for as long as I draw breath, because I am a hunter, and my prey are the monsters in the dark. The shadows were lengthening as I hiked into the backcountry campground, my ranger hat pulled low over my brow. I'd walked these trails 1,000 times over my years stationed in the heart of the National Forest of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. But today, an eerie silence hung over the forest. No birdsong, no skittering of small creatures in the underbrush. Only the crunch of my boots on dry leaves. As I entered the campground, my blood ran cold. The Malon tents were shredded, their contents strewn about like the aftermath of a tornado. Dark stains marred the ground, with blood still glistening wet in the fading light. I froze, straining my ears, but heard nothing except the hammering of my own heart. A child's stuffed bear lay by the cold remains of a campfire. Deep claw marks rent its fuzzy body, spilling white stuffing onto the trampled earth. A howl suddenly echoed through the trees, guttural and savage. It was like no sound I had heard in all my years ranging through these woods. Fear prickled up my spine as I drew my pistol with a shaking hand. Something was out there, something hungry. I radioed the incident into dispatch with a trembling voice requesting backup, but I already knew help would be a long time coming in this remote wilderness. Memories flooded back to me of the disturbing stories I had heard over the years. Tales of hikers vanishing without a trace, leaving only shredded gear and bloodstains behind. Grisly encounters with things that walked like men that ran on all fours. Livestock found mutilated in their pens, flesh torn by enormous claws and fangs. I had always dismissed them as backwoods superstition, tall tales told around a campfire. But now, standing alone in the gathering, dark, I wasn't so sure. An icy gust of wind sent dead leaves skittering across my boots. The back of my neck prickled with the uncanny feeling of being watched from the shadows of hungry eyes studying me, marking me as prey. The words of an old Ojibwe elder echoed through my mind, his weathered face grave as he warned me of the things that stalk these ancient forests. The beings he called those who walk, like both of them. Not animal, not human, something in between and older than time. Darkness swallowed the forest as I cautiously tracked the trail of carnage away from the ravaged campsite. I tried to calm my racing thoughts to focus on the task at hand, but every snapping twig and rustling leaf made me flinch. Up ahead, shadows moved against the natural patterns of the swaying branches. Too big to be a deer, too quick and silent to be a bear. My pulse pounded in my ears. A beam of moonlight pierced the canopy, illuminating a horrific scene. Torn limbs and bloody fur littered a small clearing, the scattered remains of a buck. The stench of death mingled with the loamy scent of the forest floor. No natural predator would leave a kill in this state. My radio crackled to life, startling me. But instead of a dispatcher's voice, only hissing static emanated from the speaker. All my electronics were malfunctioning, compasses spun uselessly. A stick cracked in the underbrush behind me. I spun, flashlight blazing. The white beam caught a flash of matted fur and pale flesh. A glimpse of something loping, galloping on 2 legs, then 4, and then the terrible howling began again from all around me, yowling cries that no wolf or animal I knew could ever make. They were hunting, and I was the prey. I crashed blindly through the night-shrouded wilderness, thorny branches tearing at my skin, my heart, a wild drum in my chest. The baying howls of the beasts reverberated through the valley, spurring me onward. My thrashing flight brought me to the yawning mouth of a cave, half hidden behind a veil of hanging vines. Without pausing to consider the wisdom of it, I dove inside, fumbling for my flashlight. The white beam played over damp rock walls, illuminating a sight that stole the breath from my lungs. Deep gouges marked the stone, cross-hatched in chaotic claw marks from hell's own demons. No natural creature had made them, and there on the muddy cave floor were tracks, footprints pressed into the muck, the splayed outline of human feet. But as I traced their path deeper into the cavern, the human tracks warped, the toes narrowing into claws, the arches elongating into haunches. I stumbled from the cave retching. Dawn was just breaking over the misty treetops. Staggering through the undergrowth, I came upon a horrific sight. Survivors from the ravaged camp, a man and a woman, clothes hanging in bloody tatters, eyes wide and vacant with terror, their mumblings defied logic, telling of towering creatures running on two legs and loping on four. Jaws that unhinged like snakes to swallow a person whole, pale eyes glowing with feral madness. Monsters. I led the shocked survivors back towards civilization as quickly as their injuries allowed, promising that help was on the way, that everything would be alright. But the words tasted like ash on my tongue. I knew nothing would ever be alright again. That night, I stood watch over the makeshift camp, shotgun braced against my shoulder, barely daring to blink. The risen moon gilded the forest, silver shadows stark beneath the reaching branches. A hulking shape moved deceptively fast between the trees for its size. Pale fur matted with mud and gore, emaciated flanks heaving. I caught the glint of moonlight on teeth, long and curved like tusks. Then it stepped into a shaft of lunar glow, and I beheld its face. My mind recoiled, rejecting the vision before me. That it couldn't be real. Dear God, it couldn't be. Yellow eyes, reptilian and cold, in a grotesquely elongated skull. Dark jaws like a bear trap, yawning open in a ferocious yowl, frothy saliva stringing from dagger-like teeth. Not wolf, not cougar, not human, other. The beast reared to its full height, towering on long, sinewy legs. Then its jaws peeled back from its teeth in what could only be called a grin, a rictus of cruelty and flesh hunger. A whimper drew my gaze to the survivors. The man was rocking, keening through split lips, hands clawing at his face. The woman stared hollow-eyed into the fire. They're not bear. She croaked, not wolves. They're not real, can't be real. Fighting the urge to scream, I met the monster's yellow gaze down the barrel of my gun. What was this abomination? What unearthly pet had spawned it? In that moment, I felt the yawning gulf of my own fragile sanity and feared the answers to those questions would shatter it. The shot from my rifle echoed through the night like cannon fire, sending the creature galloping into the shadows with a snarl. Black blood dribbled from its matted fur. The mad energy of desperation fueled my aching muscles as I tracked the beast's spoor through the underbrush, determined to end this nightmare. The trail led me to a stony hollow ringed by towering pines, their branches seeming to lean together to repel the feeble light. The reek of rot and old blood assaulted me as I ducked into the beast's lair. Bones crunched under my boots, splintered femurs and cracked skulls gnawed clean of all flesh, grisly trophies of the creature's hunts. The glow of my flashlight glinted off something metallic in the corner, battered camping gear, mangled cameras, even a dented canteen with a U.S. Forest Service logo. Souvenirs of past victims. Dear God, how long had this thing been stalking these woods? How many people had it dragged screaming into this fetid den? A glint of something shiny caught my eye. Crouching, my stomach lurched. It was a small gold locket shaped like a heart, the kind a young girl might wear. Inside was a photo of a smiling child, her proud parents beaming beside her. The realization struck me like a hammer blow. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a mindless beast. Some twisted spark of cruel intelligence glinted behind those hellish yellow eyes. It collected trophies. It had a concept of cruelty. My daughter. That thing took my baby. The woman's broken sobs reached me. The man just rocked and stared. Something vital shadowed behind his eyes. A growl rumbled from the shadows at the back of the den. So low I felt it in my bones more than heard it. Not one creature, multiple. The fetid stench of death and carrion made my gorge rise. Fresh kills, they were still feeding. I stumbled back into the night on numb legs, my mind refusing to process the horrors in that cave. The survivors still huddled by the guttering fire, but their eyes empty, lifeless, broken. They had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had shattered them. That was when I truly began to understand the mind-breaking reality of what we faced out here. Ancient things, cruel and clever, with a taste for human suffering. God help us all. The next hours blurred into a primal haze of fear and exhaustion. The beasts harried our desperate flight through the wilderness, howling and gibbering from the shadows, yet never fully revealing themselves, toying with us. My rifle ammo dwindled to nothing. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into Stygian gloom. The survivors stumbled on wounded legs, leaving a trail of blood for the creatures to follow. The hunt was on, and we were the prey. From the darkest pit of the night they came for us, pale shapes loping out of the woods on our flanks, charging on all fours, then rearing up to dash forward on two legs with horrifying speed. The yowls curdled my blood. There were three of them, three towering horrors with grinning jaws and dead yellow eyes glinting with feral madness. Matted fur, stiff with dried blood, sinewy muscles rippling beneath mottled hides, claws like scimitars. We run, I croaked to the survivors, shoving them ahead of me. Run. I turned to face the stalking things, knowing I was the only thing standing between these people and an unthinkable fate. I had failed, so many already led them into this heart of darkness. I refused to fail again, even if it cost my life. Sight and blood blurred my vision. My heart hammered. The stink of the creatures filled my nostrils. I raised my empty rifle like a club, bellowing my defiance. If I was to die, I would die fighting. The beasts answered with howls of savage glee and charged as one. Jaws slavering, claws extended. Tidal wave of fury and teeth and pain crashed down on me. I screamed. I bolted upright on the hospital bed. A shriek lodged in my raw throat. Agony lanced through my ravaged body, barely muted by the morphine drip in my arm. The cold clinical light stung my eyes. It took long minutes for the night sweats to fade, for my racing heart to steady, for reality to reassert itself. I wasn't in those woods anymore. I had made it out, allegedly survived. The door creaked open and a severe woman in a black suit slipped inside. Mr. Grimes, I'm Agent Santos with the Fish and Wildlife Service. How are you feeling? Her tone made it clear she didn't care. This wasn't a social call. The doctors say you've been having night terrors, she continued, studying me coldly. You've been raving about monsters, unnatural things in the woods. Do you have anything to add to that? Translation: stick to the story. They survived it. The image of their broken, bloodied forms being loaded into the ambulance flitted through my mind. They would never be the same. Hell, I would never be the same. But one look at the agent's face told me all I needed to know. Speak of the truth, and it would be the psych ward for me. I'm not sure what I saw. I rasped finally. The lie bitter on my tongue. Must have been a bear. Or maybe a cougar. I panicked. Everything after that is jumbled. Agent Santos' pen scratched across her notepad. So noted. Your confused account matches the others. The official story. Cougars, bears, tragic animal attacks. Nothing more. The stuff of rangers. Campfire tales not shattering reality. I didn't have to be told that speaking otherwise would only lead to ruin. They'd make sure of it. Your rangers will be in to debrief you soon, Santos said coolly, snapping her notepad shut. The agency thanks you for your discretion in this matter. As the door clicked shut behind her, I sagged back against the pillows, pain and exhaustion dragging me down. I knew sleep would only bring the nightmares, hellish yellow eyes and grinning jaws in the dark. The screams of the taken, the stench of blood and ruin. I survived, but I would never escape. The true face of the wilderness had been revealed to me, and it was a visage of horror. And deep in those primal woods, I knew that the beast still prowled, still hunted, an eternal patient hunger in the dark. The thin beam of my flashlight flickered across the dark forest as I trudged along the overgrown trail. Branches snagged at my park ranger uniform. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, making me flinch. I was already on edge. At 32 years old, I had taken this job as a last resort. Unable to make ends meet with the meager pay from my previous gig working retail back home in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I had always loved the outdoors and jumped at the opportunity to become a ranger, even if it meant relocating to this remote wilderness in Oregon. And nothing could have prepared me for the strange events that began to unfold. It started with small, eerie sounds in the night, footprints on trails where no one had been, a pervasive sense of being watched from the shadows of the dense woods. I tried to shake it off as the overactive imagination of a city boy unaccustomed to the isolation out here. But then the first hiker went missing, a young woman who had embarked on a solo trek to one of the more secluded lakes. When she failed to return to her car after 2 days, I helped lead the search party to track her down. After hours of scouring the rugged terrain, calling her name until my voice went hoarse, all we found was her backpack, torn and bloody as if mauled by a vicious predator. But no animal tracks could be found. Uneasiness crept through the small ranger station as the days ticked by with no sign of the lost hiker. Whispers began to circulate about old legends, long told by locals, of dark, malevolent things that roamed these woods. Ancient creatures, neither human nor beast. I had scoffed at such far-fetched folk tales, dismissing them as backwoods superstition. Until that fateful night, I found myself alone at the edge of the trail, staring into the abyss under a moonless sky. A twig snapped behind me and I spun around, my flashlight beam landing on a pair of feral, luminous eyes peering out from the underbrush. A shiver ran down my spine. Someone was out there in the night, watching and waiting. As I stood, frozen to the spot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted and that I would soon discover the truth behind the dark folklore of the forest. The rangers gathered solemnly in the cramped main office, an anxious hush hanging over the room. And listened only half-focused as our superintendent, Jeff, laid out the plans for another search operation for the missing hiker. My mind was still reeling from the glimpse of those terrifying eyes in the dark. I watched Jeff's gaunt face as he spoke, noticing for the first time the deep worry lines etched around his eyes and the strands of gray threading his beard. I recognized the same haggard look of exhaustion that I saw in my own reflection these days. I want everyone to stay alert and keep close tabs on all backcountry permits, Jeff said gravely, his hands tightening on the edge of the battered wooden desk. No one else goes missing on our watch. But as his gaze met mine across the room, I saw the flicker of fear he couldn't quite conceal. We both knew that there were things lurking out in the rugged wilderness of this park, things that couldn't be explained. After we were dismissed, I cornered Jeff as the other rangers filed out of the office. Lowering my voice, I pressed him about the old campfire stories and whispered legends. Those eerie folk tales I had once laughed off now took on a chilling new significance. Jeff sighed heavily, looking much older than his 50-odd years. "Look," he said, "I've been rangering these woods for over 2 decades now. And there's more truth to those old stories than most would like to admit. There's something out there in the deep woods, something unnatural." The shudder ran through me at his ominous words. He proceeded to tell me fragmented tales passed down by the locals for generations, sinister accounts of ancient creatures, dark rites conducted in hidden groves, bizarre disappearances going back over 100 years. Of a primeval forest spirit neither benevolent nor evil, but utterly inhuman. I left the ranger station that day with a growing sense of trepidation gnawing my gut. The missing hiker, the feral eyes in the night. Somehow I knew it was all connected to the dark folklore entwining these woods. As I gazed out at the towering evergreens surrounding the station, I couldn't suppress a shiver of dread. An ancient malevolence lurked out there, and it was growing bolder. The forest had always been a sanctuary to me, but now, as I ventured out alone under the gray light of dawn to resume the search, the looming trees felt more menacing than peaceful. An unsettling hush enveloped the woods, broken only by the occasional distant scream of a hawk. As I trekked deeper into the wilderness, the old folktales Jeff had revealed preyed on my mind. I couldn't shake the uncanny feeling that I was being lured into the heart of a forest by an unseen force, that my every move was being tracked by the malicious entity sent to haunt this place. Wiping the sweat from my brow, I continued climbing the narrow switchback up the steep hillside, fallen leaves skittering underfoot. An uneasy feeling crept up my spine as I recalled the blood-soaked shreds of the missing hiker's backpack. What gruesome scene would I stumble upon out here in these eerie woods? A chill shook me as an errant breeze rustled through the trees, sending a flurry of autumn leaves raining down. An eldritch smell hung on the frigid dust, the scent of damp loam and decay, of something dark and ancient. Suddenly, an oppressive sense of being watched crashed over me, raising the hairs on my neck. I could feel them out there, the baleful eyes from campfire stories, peering through the veil of shadows, tracking every step I took. My hand tightened reflexively around the cold metal of my service pistol in its holster. Forcing down fear rising in my throat, I continued my march up the slope. But with each step, the prickling sensation of unseen eyes boring into me intensified. A twig snapped in the underbrush. I cast a quick look over my shoulder, but saw nothing behind me but dense tangles of trees and vegetation. As I crested the ridge, my blood turned to ice in my veins. There, snagged on a branch at the edge of the trail, fluttered a torn shred of fabric. A closer look revealed it to be from a raincoat, the same vivid blue as the one the missing hiker had been wearing. With shaking fingers, I unhooked the ragged scrap of nylon, dread twisting my stomach as I examined the unmistakable dark stains marring the material. I scanned the forest floor, my heart thundering wildly. A few yards ahead, undergrowth looked disturbed and trampled, as if something had been dragged into the woods. Swallowing hard, I crept forward for a closer look and froze. A single hiking boot lay abandoned in the dirt. It was streaked with blood. I burst into the ranger station, still clutching the torn, blood-stained jacket. Jeff's eyes widened as I held it up, his weathered face going slack with dread. He snatched it from my trembling hands, fingering the ragged edges with a grim look. "Where did you find this?" he asked sharply, meeting my gaze. I shook my head, struggling to catch my breath. Out of the ridge past the North Fork, I panted. There was blood in the boot. "Something bad happened out there, Jeff." He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, I was taken aback by the haunted look in their depths. He suddenly seemed to carry the weight of many dark secrets. "It's happening again," he said softly, almost to himself. "Just like when I first started out here all those years ago, the disappearances, the whispers of something in the woods." Jeff proceeded to tell me about his own unnerving experiences in his early days as a ranger. The strange sounds outside my cabin at night, hikers returning from the backcountry with wild tales of being stalked by an unseen presence, the mangled remains of deer and other wildlife turning up in the deep woods ravaged almost beyond recognition, and the disappearances, like the young ranger I had trained with who vanished without a trace on a routine patrol. All that was ever found of him was his shredded uniform drenched in blood. People say it's a bad spirit that lives in the oldest, darkest parts of the forest. Jeff said quietly, "Something that's guarded this land since long before man walked here, and it doesn't take kindly to intruders in its woods." An icy tingle ran up my spine at his ominous words. I couldn't help but recall the old Native American legends I had read about in the park archives. Tales of an ancient nature spirit dwelling in the primeval forest, neither good nor evil, but fiercely territorial. Supernatural beings that took the form of strange beasts. I shook my head in disbelief, struggling to reconcile Jeff's eerie accounts with the serene wilderness I had grown to love. But I knew in my gut he was telling the truth. Everything I had experienced out there in the woods was neither human nor animal, but something far more chilling lurked in the ancient forest and had marked me as a trespasser. I had fell over the wilderness like a dark shroud, transforming the rustling forest into an alien landscape. Shadows became deeper, sounds more distorted. Every snapping twig and leaf skittering across the forest floor made me flinch. I gripped my flashlight tightly as I made my way down the hiking trail, an icy feeling of dread coiling in my gut. Shift's words reverberated through my head. Could there really be some vengeful superhuman entity lurking in these woods, preying on unwary hikers and rangers? A sudden piercing shriek rent the night air, sending a jolt of terror down my spine. It was an unearthly sound, neither animal nor human. A predatory cry of something unimaginable. I stood frozen, my heart jackhammering in my chest as I strained my ears in the eerie hush that followed. But only the mournful hoot of an owl and the soft sigh of wind in the treetops met my ears. Forcing my leaden feet into motion, I continued down the narrow, moonlit trail, but with each step a growing sense of being stalked crept over me. The back of my neck prickled with the weight of unseen eyes tracking my every move. Quickening my pace, I swung my flashlight beam wildly through the trees. All at once I caught a flash of luminous eyes glinting back at me from the undergrowth, and huge dark shape moving through the shadows. It was bipedal, but far too large to be human. My blood turned to ice as a pungent feral scent hit my nostrils, like wet animal fur and decay. In sheer panic, I bolted blindly through the trees, crashing through the underbrush as branches slapped my face and tore at my uniform. My lungs screamed as I gulped the frigid night air. My pulse was a deafening drum in my ears. But even louder was the sound of heavy footfalls behind me, gaining ground. My stomach twisted in terror. The forest spirit of ancient folktales was real, and it was hunting me. I glanced through the trees. I could just make out the faint lights of the distant ranger station. But a strangled gasp escaped my lips as I stumbled into a small clearing and saw the grisly scene awaiting me, illuminated in the ghostly light of the full moon. The ravaged bodies of a doe in foam lay splayed on the blood-soaked ground, flesh and bone savagely pulled apart, as if torn by monstrous claws and teeth. A wave of nausea gripped me as I clamped a hand over my nose and mouth, gagging from the overpowering metallic tang of blood and viscera. My horror shifted to mortal dread as I perceived the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping behind me. I spun around just in time to see a pair of glowing, inhuman eyes emerge from the tree line at the edge of the clearing. The hulking silhouette of a nightmarish figure began to take shape in the darkness. My blood ran cold as the creature crept forward, its lips curling back to reveal wickedly sharp teeth. I was staring into the face of a monster out of darkest lore. Adrenaline flooded my veins as I turned and fled across the blood-spattered clearing, clearing my boots, pounding the earth and slamming my heart against my ribs. Behind me came the guttural snarls of the terrifying creature giving chase. I crashed headlong through the underbrush, clawing my way through the tangled web of branches and thorn bushes, ignoring the sharp sting of brambles tearing my skin. I burst from the tree line onto a rocky slope. My flashlight flew from my hand as I stumbled, rolling wildly down the hillside in a frantic slide. White-hot pain shot up my left leg as my knee slammed into a boulder. Fighting back a scream, I staggered upright and limped on into the night, desperate to put distance between myself and the ravenous forest spirit pursuing me. The terrain grew steeper and more treacherous with each faltering step, an uneven landscape of deadfall and boulders. The metallic tang of my own blood mingled with my sweat and the cloying reek of the creature on the air. My breath came in sharp, agonized gasps as I hobbled up the incline, thorny underbrush snagging my torn uniform. A backward glance revealed the shadowy silhouette of the creature loping through the forest below, slowly but steadily gaining ground. Wicked moonlight glinted off its terrible teeth and claws. Despair lanced through me as I dragged myself over a fallen log. There was no outrunning this nightmarish beast. Ancient and primal, a malevolent spirit of untamed nature, it knew every inch of this wilderness, moved through it like a wraith. I was just clumsy human prey, far from help. The startled cry fled my lips as the log suddenly shifted under me, pitching me face first into the dirt. The mossy ground gave way beneath my body weight, and to my shock, I found myself tumbling into a small fissure concealed in the hillside. Foul, musty air enveloped me as I landed hard on the floor of the narrow tunnel, fracturing my wrist. Fighting back the fiery pain, I crawled deeper into the clammy darkness, hoping the cave would offer some meager shelter from the creature that it wouldn't follow me into this dank hole. I huddled there in the gloom, trying to quiet my ragged breathing, straining my ears over the wild thudding of my own heart. The dank air swam with the acrid stench of wet animal fur and decay. The cold sweat slicked my skin as I realized the putrid smell was growing stronger, threaded with a metallic tang of blood. My stomach knotted with sick dread. The soft scuttle of disturbed earth made me look up, and the scream rising in my throat came out only as a strangled whimper as I beheld the hideous figure hunched at the mouth of the tunnel. In the gray light filtering in, its form was a blasphemous melding of man and beast. Something ancient and unnatural, something that should not be. A pair of glowing feral eyes met mine in the gloom. Wicked teeth glinted as its jaws gaped open, and then it lunged. The forest spirit flew at me in an explosion of matted fur and jagged claws, its hulking form filling the tunnel. A strangled scream tore from my throat as I threw my arms up in a feeble attempt to shield my face from the slashing talons. My spine slammed into the tunnel wall as the creature's bulk crashed into me, claws scrabbling and jaws snapping mere inches from my jugular. Pulse thundering in my ears, I thrashed and kicked with every ounce of my remaining strength, trying desperately to throw the beast off me. But it was like fighting a grizzly bear in a dark closet. The stench of its foul breath enveloped me, rancid with the reek of rotting flesh. Sharp rock bit into my back as the creature pressed its attack, its snarling mouth lunging for my throat. Raw panic surged through my veins. I knew that at any second those awful teeth would rip into my soft flesh, tear it from bone, just like the ravaged bodies in the clearing. In the last burst of desperation, I rammed my knee into the creature's gut with all my might. To my shock, it let out a pained grunt and fell back a step. Not daring to believe my luck, I hurled myself at the narrow opening of the tunnel. I scrambled frantically over the loose earth and jagged rocks, hauling myself toward the mouth of the cave with the last of my strength. Behind me, I could hear the forest spirit's guttural snarls building again as it recovered from my blow. I had barely dragged myself over the lip of the fissure when a clawed hand clamped around my ankle like a steel trap. A gurgled scream tore from my throat as the creature yanked me violently backward. My fingers raked the ground, nails tearing as I fought to cling to anything I could. But the beast was terribly strong, inhumanly so. With a vicious tug, it wrenched me completely out of the tunnel. The world spun dizzyingly as I was flung through the air like a rag doll. All the air whooshed out of my lungs as my back slammed into a tree trunk. I slumped to the ground, gasping for breath, pain spiderwebbing across my ribs. Through my spotty vision, I could just make out the hulking silhouette of the creature stalking toward me across the moonlit forest floor, slowly savoring the moment before the kill. Ours easy prey, now injured, exhausted, my strength spent. Squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the agony of fang and claw, wishing I had never taken this job, never set foot in this godforsaken forest. The shrill report of a gunshot cracked the night, shattering the grisly scene. My eyes flew open to see the dark figure of the forest spirit jerk back as if struck. Jeff stood at the edge of the trees, his rifle aimed steadily at the creature, his eyes hard as flint above his grizzled beard. "Get away from him, you filthy thing," he gritted out through clenched teeth, working the rifle bolt. The spirit let out an enraged roar that sent icy tendrils down my spine. Jeff fired again as it lunged for him in a blur of matted fur and teeth. The creature staggered but kept coming, its eyes glowing with feral bloodlust. I watched in horror as man and beast collided, writhing mass of snarls and flying fists. Jeff pummeled every inch of the creature he could reach with the butt of his rifle, but even his well-honed strength was outmatched by the forest spirit's preternatural power and ferocity. Claws tore through Jeff's shirt, drawing cries of pain from the man as they raked his flesh. I struggled to pull myself upright against the tree, desperate to help him, my mind racing. There had to be something, anything I could do. And then I remembered the old stories Jeff had shared, the lore passed down over generations of how the native tribes once appeased the forest spirits, fighting back fresh waves of agony. I rocked my knife from my belt and slashed it across my palm. The cloying scent of my blood filled the air as it ran down my fingers. With a shaking hand, I held my dripping palm out to the creature, an offering. The forest spirit froze mid-swipe, its head swiveling toward me. For a long, terrible moment, I thought it would lunge at me again to devour me whole. But then it stalked slowly to my side. Snuffling, it ran a long black tongue over my bloodied hand, lapping up the crimson rivulets. As the creature drank my blood, the manic light faded from its eyes. When it lifted its head to look at me again, the feral rage was replaced by something disturbingly like respect, or perhaps acceptance. Then, with a final huff of its terrible snout, the forest spirits turned and melted back into the shadows between the trees, as if it had never been there at all, just a figment of darkest folklore once more. Gray light was seeping through the trees by then. Jeff and I limped our way back to the ranger station, leaning on each other for support. We looked like we had both gone 10 rounds with a mountain lion, our uniforms shredded and blood-soaked faces a mess of bruises and lacerations. But we were alive. Once our wounds were cleaned and bandaged, I slumped at the tiny kitchen table, too spent even to process the surreal horror of what we had just survived. Jeff set a tin mug of camp coffee in front of me, and the usually comforting scent turned my stomach. He eased himself into the chair across from me with a pained grunt. His expression was as haggard as I felt. "You know we can tell anyone the truth about what happened out there," he said quietly after a long moment, meeting my haunted gaze. "They'd think we were crazy or fire us on the spot." I nodded slowly, the movement sending a lance of pain through my bruised skull. He was right. Even I could barely believe what I had seen, what had terrorized us through the night. A primeval being out of darkest myth, something that shouldn't exist outside of campfire stories or ghost stories. The official line will be that the missing hiker and the other disappearances were bear attacks. Jeff continued grimly. "And what happened to us? A bat fall down a ravine while searching, nothing else." His weathered face was lined with sorrow and exhaustion, the look of a man who had carried dark secrets for far too long. For the first time, I fully understood the burden he had borne in silence all these years as a ranger in this forest, the unsettling truth behind the old legends, horrors that would forever haunt him. In the days and weeks that followed, I threw myself into my work with renewed purpose, but I knew my time as a ranger here was limited. As much as I loved the wilderness, I could never again walk beneath these ancient trees without feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me, without remembering the hideous face of the creature that had nearly taken my life. The memory of its fetid breath and jagged claws would stalk my nightmares for years to come. At night, I was still haunted by the screams of crows and ghostly sobs on the wind, which sounded like the anguished cries of a lost hiker damned to wander the forest forever as part of the spirit's macabre collection of souls. More than once, I woke in a cold sweat, gripped by visions of glowing eyes peering in through my cabin windows. Deep down, I knew that soon I would leave this place and try to outrun the trauma and terror of what I had experienced in the name of this ill-fated job. But I also knew that it would forever be a part of me, like a scar on my soul. The forest had marked me as one of its own, a keeper of its darkest secrets. And though I had survived my brush with the ancient folklore of the woods, it had exacted a toll. When I closed my eyes, I could still feel the rasp of a long black tongue licking blood from my palm and taste the acrid flavor of fear on my tongue. Sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, it almost felt like a perverse communion or a promise of dark wonders to come if ever I dared venture into the endless fathoms of trees again. I've always loved the great outdoors. Growing up in the suburbs of Milwaukee, my happiest memories are of family camping trips to the north woods of Wisconsin. The fresh air, towering pines, campfires under the stars. I knew from a young age that I wanted to spend my life in the wilderness. So when I graduated college with a degree in forestry and landed a job with the National Park Service, I was thrilled. My first posting was at Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore in Michigan's remote Upper Peninsula. I was 22, fit, energetic, and eager to start my career as a ranger. The job was demanding but deeply fulfilling. I guided hikes, fought wildfires, performed search and rescue missions. There's no feeling like finding a lost hiker and bringing them to safety. I loved educating visitors about the forest ecosystems and helping them appreciate the beauty of the backcountry. Most of my coworkers were welcoming, but a few old-timers gave me a hard time at first. They sized me up, this soft city kid invading their territory. They would need to toughen me up, they did. I quickly learned to hold my own. After a few seasons, I moved on to other assignments. Crater Lake in Oregon, Allegheny in Pennsylvania, and the Great Smoky Mountains in North Carolina. With each new park, I fell more in love with the job. I felt so privileged to live and work in some of the most stunning natural places in the country. Being a guardian and ambassador for these lands was my calling. But the job took a toll. The pay was modest, and I had student loans to repay. Finding housing in remote areas was a constant challenge. Relationships were difficult due to the frequent relocations and unpredictable hours. I grew accustomed to solitude as a necessity rather than a choice. Still, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. The wilderness sang to my soul. I needed to be out there listening to the wind in the branches and watching the play of light through the leaves. Even on the toughest days, I'd catch a glimpse of a bald eagle soaring overhead or an elusive lynx slipping through the underbrush, and all the struggle would melt away. I belonged to the forest, and dead to me. After nearly a decade with the Park Service, I accepted a backcountry patrol position in the Chickamauga-Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. It felt like a homecoming, returning to my native state. I'd be covering a vast territory on multi-day solo treks, monitoring trails and campsites and keeping an eye out for trouble. I was excited to test my skills and spend long stretches in deep wilderness. Little did I know that trouble was already watching for me, awaiting my arrival. Coiled in the shadowed heart of the forest, among ancient hemlocks and moss-shrouded boulders, the darkness I had only glimpsed in fireside tales and old bloggers' yarns. I thought they were only stories meant to frighten children and greenhorns. I was about to find out how real the old legends are, and that I wasn't nearly as prepared as I believed to face what lurked in the primeval depths of the Northwoods. My first week in Chuckamegan was a blur of orientation and settling in. I'd be based out of a small ranger station, just a one-room cabin really perched on the edge of Teal Lake. The thick pine and hemlock forest crowded in close around the building, the deep woods beginning just steps from the door. That suited me fine. I had no interest in office work. The backcountry was my beat now. My supervisor, an affable man in his 50s named Doug, gave me the lay of the land over a topographic map unfurled on the rough wooden table. Our patrol area covers about 30 square miles, mostly roadless, he said, tracing a finger along faded contour lines. A few established trails exist, but plenty of blind spots too. Old logging roads, hunters, trails, coulees, and canyons. Lots of places for folks to get turned around if they wander off track. I nodded, assessing the terrain. It would be challenging, but nothing I couldn't handle. I was a seasoned hiker with top-notch navigation skills. While life is definitely active in there, Doug continued, plenty of deer, black bear, coyotes, bobcat, even timber wolves making a comeback in the area. Keep a clean camp and know what to do if you encounter something big. Always, I said. I'd had experience with charismatic megafauna before. Rule 1 was give them space and don't act like prey. Another thing, Doug lowered his voice a bit, as if about to share a secret. You may hear some stories from old-timers around here about things in the woods. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Tall tales, mostly. Legends about strange creatures, ghostly apparitions, that sort of thing. The Ojibwe and Menominee have tales going way back. I chuckled. Well, I know much for ghost stories, but I'll keep an ear out for anything interesting. That's the spirit, Doug said, rolling up the map. Anyway, you'll head out on your first circuit tomorrow, 5 days to start. I'll expect you to check in by radio each evening, just so we know all's well. After he left, I went outside to watch the sun set over Teal Lake. The glassy water reflected a glowing pink and orange sky, the trees standing in silent silhouette. It was utterly serene, the kind of scene that made my spirit sing. This was where I belonged, enfolded in the vast tranquility of the wild. But as the last embers of daylight faded into dusk, I couldn't shake a subtle tension in the air. A watchful stillness like the forest was holding its breath. The hackles on my neck prickled. I suddenly felt exposed in the gathering, dark, and hurried back inside the cabin, securing the door behind me. Unease trailed me into sleep that night, manifesting in restless dreams of endless trees and watchful shadows. Something felt different about this forest, wilder, more untamed. The domain of older, stranger things than I was accustomed to. But surely it was just the unfamiliarity of a new place, I told myself. The isolation playing tricks on my mind. By the light of day, the woods would feel like home again, and I'd be ready to begin my guardianship of this ancient, precious wilderness. If only I'd known then what awaited me in the lightless heart of the forest. What hungers hid in the primeval shadows, as old as the land itself. Already marking my scent, coveting my warm blood and racing heartbeat, dreaming of my flesh caught in their teeth and claws. I was stepping blindly into their world, a trespasser in a domain that had never belonged to men, and they did not intend to let me leave it alive. Dawn broke cold, and misty tendrils of fog threading through the hemlock boughs. I shouldered my pack after a quick breakfast and set out along the Teal Lake Trail, my boots crunching softly in the dewdap needles. The first few miles passed uneventfully as I followed the rugged trail skirting the lakeshore. Ghostly columns of mist rose off the mirrored surface, swirling up to join their brethren, drifting between the towering trees. An ethereal stillness lay over the land, the usual chatter of songbirds muted in the hush. It was an eerie kind of beauty, but I relished the solitude. Just the susurrus of my breath and the rhythm of my footfalls to accompany me. These woods felt older, richer somehow, They had a weight to them, like bygone years compiled underfoot. If trees could talk, the tales these ancients could tell. Around mid-morning, I paused on a rocky overlook to consult my map and compass. By my calculation, the trail should soon link up with an old logging road that would take me deeper into the backcountry. I knew there were some hunters' cabins and campsites scattered back there that I'd want to check on. I just stowed my map when a flicker of movement snagged the corner of my vision, something large and dark slipping between the trees below. My pulse kicked up instinctively, bear maybe. But it had moved more fluidly than any bear, or like a big cat, a fluid ripple of muscle, except that bobcats didn't get that large. And cougars had been declared locally extinct decades ago, though there were occasional unconfirmed sightings. And I shook my head, moving on, probably just a trick of the mist and shadows. The trail descended steeply from the overlook, switchbacking down a narrow ravine. Drifts of fog pooled in the low spot, swirling chill around my ankles. An icy trickle of unease wound down my spine, though I couldn't say why. My senses felt heightened, attuned to every whisper of breeze and snap of a twig. I nearly yelped aloud when my radio crackled to life at my belt. "Kowalski, come in. This is Ranger Station Alpha over." Feeling foolish, I unclipped the radio and depressed the talk button. "This is Kowalski. Go ahead, Alpha. How's it looking out there?" "Overall quiet on the Teal Lake front," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just some fog burning off over." "Roger that. You'll be heading up towards Sawmill Creek today." "Yeah, over affirmative. Planning to make camp there tonight." "Over 10-4. Watch your step back in there. It's some rough country over and out." "Copy that. Kowalski out." I clipped the radio back on my belt, oddly reassured by the crackly connection to humanity. Doug's voice had sounded a bit strained, though, as if he were worried about more than just the terrain. I pushed the thought aside and soldiered on, the trail leveling out as I reached the old logging road. It was more of a vague clearing between the trees than a real road, half reclaimed by the forest. Low brush and creeping vines blurred the edges, reaching across the stony track. I imagined it would be nearly impassable to a vehicle now. The mist finally began to dissipate as I hiked, replaced by slanting sunbeams that dappled the forest floor. But the brightening day did little to lift the strange atmosphere. The old-growth trees felt more ominous than majestic, their shadows pooling thick and deep. A heaviness hung in the air, gravid with longevity and memory, and a sudden awareness prickled the back of my neck. That instinctive sense of being observed. I spun around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The telltale glow of eyes between leaves, no suggestion of bulk or breathing. But the feeling persisted, a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades. I was gripped by the unshakable conviction that something was watching me, tracking me, studying my movements with a deep and alien hunger. I began walking faster, my hand resting close to my belt and the bear spray holstered there. The road curved ahead, disappearing into the gloom beneath the dense canopy. Apprehension squeezed my chest as I fought the irrational urge to break into a run to try to outrun the dreadful thing I sensed flowing through the shadows. Unseen but unmistakably present. Predatory and covetous, something very old and very dark lived in these woods. I knew it then, a revelation that settled into my bones with a chill, and it was keenly aware of my intrusion into its domain. But what it wanted that I feared I would discover all too soon. Alone in the remote vastness of forests, far from any aid or inkling of this ancient malice that now stalked me, the tree trunks seemed to crowd closer, their branches reached out with grasping limbs. The forest felt more hostile with each step I took, a prickling enmity oozing from bark and loam. This was not a place for men. That much grew clearer with every breath. A twig snapped behind me, sharp as a gunshot in the loaded silence. I whirled around, my heart hammering out a panic tattoo against my ribs. Tall yellow eyes burned back at me from the gloom. For a breathless moment, I stared into those unblinking eyes. They seemed to float, disembodied in the murky space between two gnarled trunks, twin lamps filled with ancient malice. A sulphurous glow that turned my bowels to water and froze the scream in my throat. Then the shadows shifted and a god silhouette emerged around the eyes. Not disembodied, but set deep in an emaciated face, both strangely human and utterly alien. Hairless skin stretched hot over jutting bones. A lopless mouth gaping in a predator's grin filled with needle-like fangs. Long, almost mantis-like limbs unfolding from a grotesquely elongated torso as the thing slunk into the wan light spearing through the canopy. It moved with a sinuous, boneless quality that made my flesh crawl. An admit blasphemy against the natural order. Clawed fingers and toes dug into the loam as it stalked closer. Yellow eyes fixed on me with a dreadful hunger. That gaze held an abyssal, sentient, dark, and calculating sense of being terribly, terribly ancient. The gaze of a creature that had lurked in the shadowed corners of the world since long before men walked upright. A primal terror seized me, then a gibbering animal panic. My hindbrain screamed at me to flee, to escape this dread thing before its awful gaze devoured me whole. Some fragment of rationality tried to insist it must be a fever dream, hallucination born of isolation and an overactive imagination. But the blood-curdling realness of the creature turned such comforting lies to ash. I fumbled for my bear spray with trembling hands, never taking my eyes from the thing, as if that flimsy canister could hold any power against this eldritch predator. But it was all I had. The creature made a sound, then a chittering rattle that raised every hair on my body. Cruel amusement glinted in its sulphurous eyes as it stalked ever closer, savoring my terror. Its spindly arms reached toward me, black claws curled in anticipation. My paralysis finally broke. With a choked cry, I turned and ran, crashing blindly into the brush in my desperate need to escape. Thorns tore at my clothing and skin, branches lashing my face, but I barely felt them. Every fiber of my being was gripped with a single imperative to get as far away from that creature, that living nightmare, as possible. In my mindless flight, I quickly lost the logging road, plunging deeper into trackless wilderness. The forest closed in around me, angry and vengeful. Roots seemed to grasp at my ankles, trying to drag me down into the fetid earth. Though my lungs screamed and my muscles burned, I didn't dare stop. But with the chittering rattle of the creature echoing behind me, drawing closer with each gasping breath. At last my foot caught on the hidden snare of roots, and I went sprawling, my packing gear scattering. The marshy ground knocked the air from my lungs, leaving me dazed and wheezing. For a moment, I simply lay there, gulping air and fighting the great creep of unconsciousness at the edges of my vision. Then the chittering sounded again, terribly close now. A new surge of adrenaline propelled me to my feet, abandoning my pack without a second thought. I had to keep moving to find some semblance of safety, if any such thing still existed in this nightmare wood. I half ran, half stumbled onward, heedless of direction. The trees blurred into a wall of brown and green. My world narrowed to the ragged drum of my heartbeat and the burn of my lungs. Time lost all meaning, measured only in the flexion of straining muscles and the relentless pursuit of my unseen hunter. After an eternity, or perhaps only minutes, I burst from the underbrush onto the stony bank of a stream. The water babbled and frothed over moss, slick boulders, carving a meandering course through the forest. A strange fog clung to the surface, despite the strengthening sun coiling like ghostly fingers. I splashed into the chill current, hoping the water might mask my scent or at least slow my tireless pursuer. But no sooner had I gained the far bank than an awful keening cry rose from the woods behind me, a sound of rage and frustrated bloodlust that curdled my soul. The creature had not lost my trail, nor did it intend to let me escape. Despair crushed my chest like a vice. My lens felt weighted with lead, my steps faltering. I couldn't run forever. And this nightmare made flesh. I knew with hideous certainty that it would never stop haunting me. But in that darkest moment, a desperate resolve kindled in my heart. I was a ranger, a guardian, sworn to protect these lands and all who walked them, even from horrors undreamed of. I would not let this creature claim me without a fight. Grit on my teeth, I pushed onward, following the course of the stream. The gargling water seemed to whisper encouragement, urging me toward a destination I could only hope would offer some shred of sanctuary. Time blurred and warped with exhaustion, but after an eternity I spotted a weathered structure through the trees ahead. An old trapper's cabin. It looked like half reclaimed by the forest. Moss furred the log walls and the roof sagged under the weight of years, but it was still standing and it had a door. A barrier I could put between myself and my relentless pursuer. With a final burst of energy, I staggered up the creaking steps and shouldered through the door, nearly weeping with relief when I spotted the heavy iron bolt. I slammed it home and slumped against the rough logs, gasping for breath in the musty dimness. The one-room cabin was bare and dusty, cobwebs veiling the corners. An old cook stove hulked against one wall. A rickety table and chair stood in the center. A moth-eaten pallet served as a makeshift bed. One shafts of light needled through gaps in the chinking. It wasn't much, but to its walls and a roof, a fragile bastion against the horror crouched in the gathering shadows outside. I could hear it, furtive rustling, the scrape of claws on wood, testing for weaknesses, seeking entry. I forced my leaden limbs to move, searching desperately for something, anything that could serve as a weapon. In the end, all I found was a rusted old hatchet, its handle half rotted. And I gripped it like a talisman, a fetish against evil. And not a moment too soon. A splintered crack rent the air as a clawed hand punched through the wall mere inches from my head, showering me with debris. Tut, the creature's keening wail, shivered the logs as it raked at the gap, trying to widen it to force its awful bulk inside. A hatchet trembled in my grip as I brandished it before me like a crucifix before a vampire. Back, I shouted, my voice cracking. You cannot have me, foul thing. I am sworn to protect this forest, even unto death. The creature paused, and for a single stretched second I thought it might retreat. That perhaps this standoff could endure until dawn's blessed light banished it back to whatever Stygian abyss had spat it forth. Then a hollow, rattling sound shook the cabin, a sound terribly akin to laughter. And the clawed hand began tearing at the wall again with renewed frenzy, the wood crackling and screaming. It would not be denied its The creature's claws scrambled at the crumbling wall, tearing through the rotting wood like parchment. One moment I knew it would rip open a hole large enough to force its hideous bulk through, and really I didn't want to imagine what would happen then. As I brandished my pitiful weapon and braced for a hopeless final stand, a flicker of movement outside the window caught my eye. A flash of orange and black amidst the green. My exhausted brain struggled to process it until an impossible realization crystallized. A tiger, a massive, powerful Siberian tiger. Its ruff bristling and fangs bared in a snarl. And it was fixated not on me, but on the caricature of nature assaulting the cabin. The creature paused in its assault, its burning eyes swiveling to meet the great cat's challenge. A chilling, keening cry ripped from its throat, a sound of frustration and rage. The tiger roared in response, a deafening sound that shook the very logs of the cabin. For a stretched moment, monster and beast faced off as primordial enemies from the dawn of time. The tiger prowled back and forth, never breaking its stare. The splintered hole in the wall gaped like a wound between them. Then, incredibly, the creature began to back away, its grotesque body unfolding and retracting into the shadows of the forest. The tiger snarled again, lunging forward in a feint. With With a final hiss of thwarted malice, the creature turned and vanished into the darkening wood, leaving only gashes in the moldering earth to mark its passing. The tiger watched it go, tail lashing until the forest swallowed the abomination. Then, with a final huff, the great cat turned its inscrutable gaze on me. There was no threat there, only a profound ancientness, a wildness beyond the petty struggles of men, dreadful and magnificent. And it too was gone, orange and black, swallowed by green, leaving me slumped and shaking on the dusty floor, alive, impossible, inconceivably alive and whole. In time, I gathered myself to stagger from the cabin and begin the long, limping journey back to the world of the familiar and sane. But I knew with certainty, lodged in my marrow, that I would never again walk in the woods with the same blind confidence, never again dismiss the shiver down my spine when shadows gather beneath the boughs. For I had glimpsed the true face of the forest, felt the brush of something coiled in its deepest reaches, ancient beyond knowing, a primordial hunger enduring from the dawn of the world, waiting for the unwise and unwary, watching always with yellow eyes bright with the promise of horror, and it suffers no trespass in its domain. My name is Clara Whitman, and I'm 26 years old. This happened to me deep in Mendocino National Forest, where I'd gone to document rare birds for a conservation project. I thought it would be a simple, solitary trip. Just me, my camera, and the wilderness. But when I found out, there was something no field guide could prepare me for. The RV rattled as I navigated the narrow dirt roads winding through the forest. It wasn't fancy, but it got me where I needed to go, remote places no one else wanted to bother with. That day, I was heading for a spot I'd read about online, a little used path called Black Feather Trail. It wasn't on official maps, but birdwatchers had claimed it was a haven for the black-throated gray warbler, a species I'd been desperate to document. The forest was dense, the kind of place where cell signals went to die. My generator had been acting up lately, but I wasn't worried. I liked the quiet, or so I thought. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the afternoon sun was already struggling to pierce through the trees. I parked the RV, grabbed my gear, and set off down the trail, my boots crunching against the leaf-strewn path. At first it was everything I'd hoped for. The forest felt untouched, alive with potential. The canopy of towering redwoods and firs filtered the sunlight into an ethereal green glow. Moss draped from the branches like verdant curtains, and the air was thick with the earthy scent of decay and growth. It was the kind of primordial forest that seemed to hold ancient secrets. But after a while, I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the wilderness, birdsong, the rustling of leaves, the skittering of small creatures in the underbrush, had vanished. The silence was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the thick carpet of pine needles. Then I saw it, a black feather lying in the middle of the trail. It was enormous, far too large for any bird I knew of, and its edges seemed sharp, almost metallic. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. The texture felt wrong and natural, more like cold steel than keratin. A chill ran down my spine, a primal warning. But I was a scientist, not prone to superstition. I shoved the feather into my pocket and kept walking. Even as the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, the trail twisted deeper into the forest, the trees growing more gnarled and ancient with each step. Their trunks were thick and misshapen, their bark deeply furrowed, like the skin of impossibly old creatures. The undergrowth became denser, brambles and ferns grasping at my legs as if trying to hold me back. That's when I saw her. She was standing by a massive ancient tree, its trunk so wide it would have taken a dozen people to encircle it. Her thin frame was barely visible through the drifting mist. She wore a tattered shawl, cobwebbed with age. Her white hair fell in wispy strands around her deeply lined face. "Turn back," she said, her voice low and raspy, like dead leaves stirring in the wind. "This is no place for you." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The old woman hadn't been there a moment ago. It was as if she'd materialized out of the mist itself. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding thin and uncertain. "You don't belong here," she said, stepping closer. Her milky white eyes, clouded with cataracts, seemed to pierce right through me. "The forest does not welcome your kind." "I'm just here for the birds," I said, trying to sound casual, even as a tremor crept into my voice. "I'm a researcher, conservationist." She tilted her head, a strange smile curled her thin lips. In the green-tinged light filtering through the canopy, her features took on a mossy, almost inhuman quality. "The birds don't sing here anymore," she said. I knew better. It would be wise to follow their example. Before I could respond, she turned and disappeared into the fog, her form dissolving like smoke on the wind. I stood there for a moment, dumbfounded, before my scientific instincts kicked in. I ran after her, crashing through the undergrowth, calling out for her to wait. But there was no sign of her. She had vanished as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving no trace, not even a bent blade of grass or a footprint in the soft earth. I made my way back to the trail, my mind reeling. Had I imagined the whole encounter? That no, it had been too real, too visceral. The old woman's words echoed in my mind, a cryptic warning. But I was here for a reason. I couldn't just abandon my research based on the ramblings of a strange old hermit. I returned to my RV unsettled but determined to stay. I wasn't about to let some local superstition scare me off. As the sun began setting, painting the sky vivid oranges and purples visible through the gaps in the trees, I set up camp. I reviewed the photos I'd taken that day, hoping to find some sign of the elusive warbler. That's when I noticed something strange. In one of the photos taken just after I'd picked up the feather, there was a shadowy figure in the background. It was faint, almost hidden among the trees. But it was there. A tall, gaunt shape with what looked like elongated limbs and a head that came to a sharp point. A trick of the light, I told myself, zooming in on the image. A play of shadows and foliage. But even as I said it, a chill crept up my spine. There was something deeply unsettling about the figure. Something that seemed to defy the natural order. I closed my laptop, trying to shake off the unease. It had been a long day, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I needed rest. I crawled into my sleeping bag. The gentle hum of the forest lulled me into an uneasy sleep. That night, I woke to a faint scratching sound. The sound was coming from outside the RV, soft and deliberate, like claws raking against metal. At first, in the foggy space between sleep and waking, I thought it might be branches scraping against the roof in the wind. But as I came to full consciousness, I realized there was no wind. The night was eerily still. Raccoons, I thought, grabbing my flashlight, or maybe a possum. The forest was full of nocturnal creatures, after all. I pulled on my boots and cautiously opened the RV door, shining my light out into the darkness. But there was nothing there. Just the forest, silent and still. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels. The scratching had stopped the moment I opened the door, as if whatever had made it was aware of my presence. I stepped out into the cool night air, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The forest floor was carpeted with leaves and pine needles, muffling my footsteps. I walked a slow circle around the RV, examining the exterior for any sign of damage or disturbance. But the metal sides were unmarked. No sign of the claws. I'd been so sure I'd heard. As I completed my circuit, I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I spun around my heart, leaping into my throat, the beam of my flashlight dancing erratically across the trees. But there was nothing there. Just the endless vertical lines of the tree trunks stretching up into the night sky. I stood there for a long moment, straining my ears for any sound, any hint of whatever had made that noise. But the forest was utterly silent. Not even the call of a night bird or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. A sudden gust of wind sent a shiver down my spine, and I hurried back inside the RV, locking the door behind me. I told myself I was being ridiculous, jumping at shadows and noises in the night. But as I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That there was something out there in the darkness. Something ancient and unknowable, and it was aware of me. Sleep did not come easily that night. My dreams were haunted by shadowy figures with elongated limbs and featureless faces reaching out for me from the depths of the forest. I woke several times, gasping sure I'd heard the scratching again, but each time there was only silence. The next morning I awoke groggy and unsettled. As I sipped my coffee and watched the sunrise through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I tried to shake off the unease of the night before. I had work to do. I couldn't let a few bumps in the night derail my research. I set out again, my camera bag slung over my shoulder, determined to find the elusive warbler. But as I stepped onto the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest felt different. Heavier, more oppressive, as if it was pressing in on me from all sides, watching, waiting. As I walked, I spotted movement high in the trees. My heart leapt as I raised my camera, focusing on the shape. It looked like a bird, but it was too large, its wings too jagged, more like tattered cloth and feathers. As I watched, it seemed to unfold, elongating in a way that defied anatomy. When I clicked the shutter, my camera malfunctioned, the lens jamming the display flickering with strange, distorted shapes. I lowered the camera, a chill running through me. I looked up searching for the creature, but it was gone. Vanished into the green expanse as if it had never been there at all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been watching me. That it was still watching me, hidden among the leaves, waiting. I couldn't get the image of that strange, jagged shape out of my mind as I made my way back to the RV that evening. The forest seemed to press in around me, the shadows deepening and reaching out with grasping fingers. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me spin around, expecting to see those tattered wings and elongated limbs. When I finally reached my campsite, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. But what I found there made my blood run cold. Strange patterns were etched into the dirt around the RV, spirals and concentric circles, interlocking and dizzying fractals, and among them, claw-like markings and deep gouges in the earth. It looked like something had been trying to dig its way out of the ground, or into it. I stood there staring at the markings, my mind reeling. This was no animal, this was no natural phenomenon. This was something else, something beyond my understanding. With shaking hands, I pulled out my satellite phone and dialed to Ethan, my mentor, the closest thing I had to a friend on this solitary expedition. He was an experienced field researcher, having spent decades documenting rare species in some of the most remote corners of the world. If anyone would know what to make of this, it would be him. Ethan, I said when he picked up, my voice trembling slightly. Have you ever heard of Blackfeather Trail? There was a pause, followed by a hiss of static on the other end of the line. Clara, why the hell are you out there? Ethan's voice was tinny and distant, but I could hear the concern, the edge of alarm. I'm tracking the black-throated gray warbler. This is supposed to be a hotspot, I said. No, Ethan. Cut me off. Clara, listen to me. Get out of there now. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had never heard Ethan sound like this. He was always so unflappable and confident. Why? What's wrong with this place? That trail, that forest has a reputation, a bad one among the locals, among certain circles. What do you mean? I asked though. Part of me didn't want to know. People say it's cursed. Ethan said that it's a place where things happen. Strange things. People go missing, come back changed, or don't come back at all. I tried to laugh, but It came out as a nervous half chuckle. "Come on, Ethan. Curses are nonsense. You don't believe in that stuff, do you?" "Doesn't matter what I believe," he said. "What matters is that place, that trail. It's not right. It doesn't want visitors. You need to leave Clara now before..." The line went dead, dissolving into static. "Ethan, Ethan." But there was no response. The satellite phone had never cut out like that before. I stood there in the gathering dusk, staring at the strange markings. The phone clutched in my hand. A gust of wind sent leaves skittering across the symbols, half erasing them. For a moment I could almost convince myself that I had imagined them. Almost that night's sleep eluded me entirely. I sat huddled in the RV, all the lights on, jumping at every noise. The forest seemed alive around me, whispering, laughing, watching. I clutched my camera like a talisman, as if it could protect me from whatever lurked outside. It was near dawn when I finally drifted off more from exhaustion than any sense of ease. And that's when the dream came. I was standing in the forest, but it was not the forest I knew. The trees were taller, older, their trunks twisted into impossible shapes. The light filtering through the leaves was a sickly luminous green, pulsing like a diseased heartbeat. And the whispers, they were everywhere. Cacophony of voices, hissing, laughing, beckoning. I spun around trying to locate their source, but they seemed to come from the trees themselves, from the very earth under my feet. Then the pain started, a searing, burning sensation on my arm. I looked down and saw a mark forming on my skin, black and jagged, spreading like spilled ink. It formed a shape, a symbol, a feather. I walked with a scream lodged in my throat, clutching my arm. For a moment I was sure I would see that mark, feel the burning pain, but there was nothing. Just smooth, unblemished skin. A dream, I told myself, just a dream. And as I sat there trying to slow my racing heart, I realized something else. The whispers hadn't stopped. I could still hear them, faint but unmistakable, coming from outside the RV, coming from the forest. I browsed out of the RV, not caring that I was barefoot. My hair was wild from sleep, and I was wearing nothing but a t-shirt and shorts. The whispers were louder out here, more distinct. They seemed to be calling my name, urging me forward. I stumbled into the woods, heedless of the branches that scraped at my skin and the rocks that cut into my feet. I had to find the source of the whispers. I had to understand what was happening to me. I don't know how long I ran, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. The forest blurred around me in a greenish haze. And then, suddenly I was in a clearing, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by towering trees. And in the center, the old woman. She looked just as she had when I first saw her, ancient and weathered. Her white hair was tangled with leaves. She was sitting cross-legged on the ground, her milky eyes fixed on me. "You," I panted, stumbling to a halt. "What's happening to me? What is this place?" She smiled slowly, sadly. "Sit," she said, patting the ground beside her. "It's time you learned the truth." I hesitated for a moment, fear and curiosity warring within me. But the whispers were softer here, less insistent. And something in the old woman's face, in her ancient, knowing eyes, compelled me. "I said this forest," she began, her voice low and hypnotic, "is all older than you can imagine. It remembers things that most have forgotten. It remembers the old ways, the old gods." She paused, her eyes distant, seeing something I couldn't. "Long ago," she continued, "this was a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. People would come here to commune with spirits, to seek wisdom, to make offerings." She gestured at the trees around us. But then the outsiders came, with their axes and saws, their disbelief and arrogance. They cut down the sacred trees, burned the offerings, drove away the spirits in the forest. The forest grew angry. A chill ran through me. The whispers had fallen. The old woman's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of centuries. I felt a chill run through me despite the warm, close air of the clearing. Angry, I whispered, almost afraid to ask, "What do you mean?" She fixed me with her milky gaze. The forest is not just trees and earth, child. It is a living thing. It has a heart, a soul. And when that was threatened, when its children were slaughtered and its sacred places desecrated, it lashed out. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. It cursed them, the outsiders, those who would do it harm. It marked them as you have been marked. My hand flew to my arm where I had seen the feather in my dream. The feather, she nodded. A warning. A sign that you have trespassed, that you have drawn the forest's gaze. But I didn't do anything. I protested. I'm not here to harm the forest. I'm trying to protect it, to study its creatures. Intentions matter little, she cut me off. You are an outsider. You do not understand the ways of this place, and you have taken something that does not belong to you. My mind flashed to the black feather in my pocket, the one I had found on the trail. The feather, I didn't know. And now you're bound to this place, she said. The forest will not let you go until you've returned what you've taken, until balance has been restored. Fear gripped me then, cold and sharp. What do I have to do? She rose to her feet, surprisingly agile for one so old. You must journey to the heart of the forest. There, you'll find a tree unlike any other. A tree that bleeds when cut, that screams when burned. You must return the feather to this tree and offer a piece of yourself in return. A piece of myself, I echoed, my voice trembling. She smiled then, a smile that held no warmth. The forest demands sacrifice, child. Only then will you be free. With that, she turned and walked into the trees, her form seeming to melt into the greenery. I called after her, but she was gone as if she had never been. I sat there for a long time, my mind reeling. A cursed forest, a bleeding tree, a sacrifice. It was too much, too strange, but the mark on my arm and the whispers in the trees, I couldn't deny what was happening to me. I had to go deeper into the forest. I had to find this tree. I had no choice. I rose to my feet, my resolve hardening. I will see this through. I will break this curse, or I will never leave this forest again. I walked for hours deeper and deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller, older, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The air grew heavy, thick, with the scent of decay and something else, ancient and musty. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be guiding me, pulling me forward. I followed them numbly, my feet moving of their own accord. And then I saw it. In a clearing, much like the one where I had met the old woman, stood a tree. But it was unlike any tree I had ever seen. It was enormous, its trunk wider than a car, its branches reaching up to scratch at the sky. But it was its color that struck me. It was black as night, black as coal, and it seemed to pulse as if it had a heartbeat. As I drew closer, I saw the scars, deep gashes in the bark, oozing a thick red sap. It looked like blood. The tree was bleeding, and then I heard the scream. It was a sound I will never forget, high and keening, filled with agony and rage. It seemed to come from the tree itself, from those gaping wounds. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth. This was it, the heart of the forest, the source of the curse. With trembling fingers, I reached into my pocket and drew out the black feather. It seemed to pulse in my hand, warm and alive. I knew what I had to do. I stepped forward and my arm outstretched. The closer I got to the tree, the more it seemed to writhe, reaching for me. The screams grew louder, filling my head and my heart. I pressed the feather to the trunk of one of the bleeding scars. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the tree shuddered. The scream rose to a crescendo and then cut off abruptly. The feather sank into the bark, absorbed like water into soil. The silence that followed was deafening. Not a voice, the old woman's voice whispered in my ear. The sacrifice child. The forest demands balance. I understood then. Trembling, I reached into my bag and drew out my knife, the one I used for collecting plant samples. I had never imagined using it for this. I placed the blade against my palm, took a deep breath, and cut. Blood welled, hot and red. I pressed my hand to the tree, mingling my blood with its sap. The tree shuddered again, but this time it was different. A sigh seemed to go through the forest, a release of tension. The whispering ceased. The heaviness in the air lifted. I stepped back, cradling my hand. The cut was deep but clean. It would heal. I knew somehow that it was over. The curse was broken. The forest had what it wanted. I made my way back to my RV slowly and numbly. I felt drained, emptied, but also strangely light, as if a weight had been lifted from me. When I reached the campsite, I found the symbols gone, their earth smooth and undisturbed. It was as if they had never been. I left the forest that day, packed up my RV, and drove, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I found a clinic, got my hand stitched up. I told them it was a hiking accident. They didn't ask many questions. I called Ethan, told him I was coming back. I didn't tell him what had happened. I didn't think he'd believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself, but when I looked at my hand, at the neat row of stitches, I knew it had been real, all of it. I returned to the city, to my life, but I was changed. You don't go through something like that and come out the same on the other side. I still research, still study birds, but I'm leery now of the places I go, of the things I disturb. I have a new respect for the old ways, for the secrets that the natural world keeps. Sometimes I wake in the night with my hand throbbing with phantom pain. I see the forest in my dreams, dark and foreboding. I hear the whispers, the screams, but I also remember the feeling of release, of balance restored. I remember the old woman's words, the forest remembers. And now so do I. I never went back to Blackfeather Trail, and if you're wise, neither will you. Some places are best left undisturbed. Some secrets best left buried. The forest keeps its own counsel, and we are just guests here. Grief flickers in the long, slow life of the trees. Tread carefully, and remember the forest is always watching. I never imagined my love of the outdoors would lead me down such a dark, haunting path. But here I am, David Larson, 28 years old, holding up at a tiny ranger station in the remote wilderness of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, jumping in every creek and snap echoing through the night. I grew up in Detroit suburbs, but spent every summer hiking and camping with my family in the Great Lakes region's lush forests. While my friends were glued to their video games, I was happiest tramping through the woods, breathing in the scent of pine and feeling the soft bed of fallen needles beneath my feet. That passion for nature followed me into adulthood. After college, saddled with student debt and struggling to launch a career in Michigan's sluggish economy, I was thrilled to land a job with the National Park Service. The pay was modest, but it was a chance to spend my days in the woods, sharing my love of the outdoors with others. Over the past 5 years, I've worked as a ranger in forests and parks across the country, from Oregon's rugged coast to Pennsylvania's rolling hills. But nothing could have prepared me for my current post in the Hiawatha National Forest. When I arrived here a month ago for a temporary summer assignment, the other rangers warned me about the strange happenings and eerie folklore surrounding these woods. They spoke of ghostly figures glimpsed among the trees, of the anguished cries of some unseen creature carried on the wind, of hikers vanishing without a trace, leaving only a scattering of torn gear and bloodied clothing behind. I laughed it off at first. dismissing their tales as silly campfire stories. But now, after 4 weeks alone in this isolated outpost, I'm no longer sure what to believe. Because I've seen and heard things that defy explanation, shapes moving in the shadows, furtive and quick haunting wails that cut through the night, sending shivers down my spine. And I felt it, the skin-crawling sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, even when I'm miles from the nearest human being. Maybe it's just isolation and overactive imagination playing tricks on my mind, but I can't shake the feeling that something is out there lurking among the pines, something ancient and hungry, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. As I sit here writing this, the wind batters my tiny cabin. Branches claw at the windows, and I pray that the sturdy walls and locked door will be enough to keep the horrors at bay for one more night. My trouble started 2 weeks ago when a group of college students ventured into the forest for an overnight camping trip. It was a common enough occurrence with 79,000 acres of pristine woods. Hiawatha is a popular destination for outdoor enthusiasts. I gave them the usual speech about safety precautions and handed them some maps before sending them on their way. They were due back by nightfall the next day, but as dusk deepened into night and there was still no sign of them, a knot of unease began to tighten in my stomach. It wasn't entirely unusual for inexperienced hikers to get turned around or take a little longer than planned, but something felt off. The night seemed unnaturally still and silent, heavy with a sense of foreboding. By dawn, with still no word from the group, I knew I had to take action. I radioed the other rangers and we launched a search party, fanning out into the woods where the students had planned to make camp. As I hiked along the winding trail, calling their names through the somber forest, an eerie sensation crept over me, as if the trees themselves were watching me with sinister intent. After hours of fruitless searching, I stumbled into a clearing and felt my heart lurch into my throat. The students' campsite was in shambles, tents shredded, sleeping bags scattered, supplies strewn across the forest floor. But even more chilling was the dark red stain splattered across a jagged rock. I didn't need the coppery scent hanging in the air to recognize it as blood. I combed every inch of that clearing and surrounding woods, my panic rising with each passing minute. But it was as if the students had simply vanished into thin air. The only clues left behind were a single hiking boot with the heel torn off and a shredded, blood-soaked sweatshirt. No tracks, no trail of belongings, nothing to indicate which direction they might have gone. As I hiked back to the ranger station that evening, defeated and heartsick, an icy certainty crystallized in my gut. The students hadn't gotten lost or injured. Something took them, something smart enough and powerful enough to spirit away 4 strong, healthy young people without a trace. And now that I've seen what it's capable of, I fear I may be next on its list. Every rustle of branches, every lonesome howl in the distance sends adrenaline spiking through my veins. I don't know if I'm being hunted by man, beast, or something else entirely. All I know is that the malevolent presence in this forest is growing hungrier, and I'm trapped here at its mercy. The days following the student's disappearance were a blur of frenzied activity. More search parties, police inquiries, distraught family members visiting the station for updates which we couldn't provide. I threw myself into the hunt, scouring every inch of the area where they'd vanished, desperate for any clue that might lead us to them. But even as my body went through the motions, my mind was consumed by the same awful question: what really happened to them? The police wrote it off as a straightforward missing persons case, speculating that the inexperienced hikers had gotten lost, injured or drowned in the many rivers snaking through the forest. But I couldn't quell my growing fear that something far darker was at work. The other rangers shared my unease, speaking in hushed tones of the eerie events and unexplained disappearances that plagued the Hiawatha. Some blamed the angry spirits of the Ojibwe people, who once called these woods home. Others whispered of hulking, furred creatures glimpsed lurking the trees. but one piece of local folklore in particular sent chills racing down my spine. The legend told of an ancient being known as the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that could possess humans or animals, transforming them into ravenous, flesh-craving monsters, eternally driven to feed their insatiable hunger. Those unlucky enough to encounter a Wendigo were destined for one of two horrific fates: a violent death between its snapping jaws and dagger-like claws, or possession. Their humanity would be devoured as they joined the creature's ranks to continue its grisly work. Could the Wendigo be more than just a spooky story? The more I turned it over in my mind, the more the unsettling details began to align. The lack of any remains or traces of the missing victims. The sensation of being stalked by an intelligent predator, and the pervasive aura of malice and hunger that seemed to hang over the entire forest. I tried to rationalize it away, to convince myself that entertaining such thoughts was a sign of my crumbling grip on reality. Surely the isolation, the stress, and the heartrending nature of the tragedy were causing my mind to conjure up demons. But once the seed was planted, I couldn't stop the icy tendrils of fear from spreading. As the search efforts wound down and life at the station returned to an uneasy routine, I found myself jumping at every snap of a twig, every flutter of leaves on the wind. Sleep eluded me, both due to my racing thoughts and the disturbing sounds filtering from the woods each night. Inhuman shrieks and wails, the cracks and crashes of some huge body moving through the underbrush. I felt myself unraveling a little more with each restless night. My frayed nerves and increasingly erratic behavior started to draw concerned looks from the other rangers. But how could I explain to them that I wasn't losing my mind? I was fighting the horrifying truth, a truth that might seal my own grisly fate. Because with each passing day, I was more convinced that the ravenous evil stalking this forest had marked me as its next victim. They say, when you stare into the abyss stares back. I never fully understood that until the night I finally came face to face with the source of the inexplicable malevolence haunting the Hiawatha. It was an encounter that left me broken, terrified, and grimly convinced of the Wendigo's existence. I woke from another thin, restless stretch of sleep to the sound of something large crashing through the woods behind my cabin. Exhausted and thoroughly spooked by the events of recent weeks, my nerves were rubbed raw and I simply couldn't take the suspense any longer. Against all better judgment, I snatched up my flashlight and headed out alone into the inky night to confront whatever was lurking out there. As soon as I stepped into the forest, an unnatural hush fell over my surroundings, as if even the animals and insects were holding their breath. The beam of my flashlight seemed pitifully feeble as it probed a dense tangle of trees. My heart hammered against my ribs, and the bitter taste of adrenaline coated the back of my throat as I strained my eyes against the oppressive darkness. After several long minutes of eerie silence broken only by my own ragged breathing, I was on the verge of turning back until I heard it. A guttural rasping growl that made my stomach clench with instinctive primal terror. I swept my flashlight toward the sound and felt the blood drain from my face as the beam fell upon a pair of reflective, rage-filled scarlet eyes glaring back at me. The creature was huge, easily over 7 feet tall, even hunched over on all fours. Its emaciated frame was wrapped in matted ash and fur, dripping with rivulets of blood, as it unfolded itself to stand erect. It glimpsed wickedly curved claws and a mouthful of jagged teeth. But it was the awful intelligence burning in those hellish eyes that froze me in my tracks, paralyzed by pure horror. In that moment, I knew with heart-stopping certainty that I was staring into the face of an ancient malice. The Wendigo of legend, the ravenous spirit that possessed humans and animals to feed its bottomless hunger for flesh. And I knew with equal certainty that I was to be its next meal. Some deeply buried prey instinct finally unfroze my leaden limbs, and I turned to run. But before I could take more than a few stumbling steps, an immense weight slammed into me from behind, crushing me to the damp forest floor. My breath rank with the smell of carrion and rot, washed over me as I felt those vicious teeth clamp onto my shoulder. White, hot agony exploded through my body and a choked scream ripped from my throat. I thrashed against the monster's hold, but I might as well have been fighting against bands of iron. As my struggles grew weaker and my vision started to tunnel, I sent up a silent prayer for a quick death, for this all to be over soon. But a death blow never came. As suddenly as it had attacked, the creature released me, bounding back into the shadows with a snarl. Lying there in a spreading pool of my own blood, drifting in and out of consciousness, a final chilling realization crept over me. It hadn't killed me. This was just the beginning of a fate far worse than death. With its bite, the Wendigo's possession over me had begun. And once that evil took root in my mind and body, I would become one of the very monsters I'd always feared, eternally enslaved by a ravenous hunger for human flesh. The world went black as I faded into a swirling void of agony and despair. I woke back in my cabin, the scream dying in my raw throat and cold sweat prickling my skin. For a disoriented moment, I thought it had all been an exceptionally vivid nightmare. But the searing pain radiating from my bandaged shoulder and the concerned faces of the other rangers hovering over me confirmed the horror of the previous night's encounter. It peppered me with questions, trying to understand what had happened. But I couldn't find the words to explain my ghastly certainty of the truth. How could I expect them to believe something as far-fetched as an attack by a mythological cannibalistic spirit? I'd sound like a madman at best, delusional from trauma and blood loss. So I mumbled something about a vicious bear before lapsing into a restless, fevered sleep. My body and mind exhausted from shock and injury. But in the days that followed, as the deep gashes across my shoulder began to heal to angry red scars, the awful implications of that night continued to fester in my heart like a psychological infection. I pored over every scrap of lore about the Wendigo I could find, desperate to understand what I might be facing. What I discovered only amplified my fear and despair. The legends spoke of the bitten victim's slow, torturous descent into madness and depravity as the spirit claimed their mind and body, corrupting their humanity with its insatiable evil. It began with strange urges, unsettling thoughts that crept through the subconscious like insidious roots, in a gnawing hunger that food couldn't touch. Vivid, grisly fantasies of tearing into hot, quivering flesh with tooth and nail. As the possession progressed, the changes became physical, lengthening limbs, sharpening teeth, unholy strength and speed. I watched for the signs in myself with obsessive dread, hyper-aware of every shift in my thoughts and body. Was the aching emptiness in my stomach simple stress and anxiety, or the first pangs of the Wendigo's eternal hunger? Were the dark, violent impulses suddenly clouding my mind just a trauma response, or its corruption taking hold? I felt powerless to discern the truth and utterly alone in my escalating panic. I couldn't share my fears with others. I couldn't burden them with the heart-stopping implications of what might be happening to me. And with every passing day, every disturbing new urge and sensation, the icy certainty grew that it was only a matter of time until I lost myself entirely. Faced with that inevitability, only two paths stretched before me. A waiting game existing in sickening dread, until I finally snapped and unleashed unthinkable atrocity on the innocent, or taking drastic measures to end things on my own terms before I became a monster. The weight of that choice pressed the air from my lungs and sent me deeper into spirals of despair. But even as I grappled with my eroding humanity, the pragmatic corner of my brain that was still clinging to sanity reminded me of one last hope, fragile and desperate as it was. Because the lore spoke of a way to break the Wendigo's possession, to reclaim your soul from its gluttonous grasp. A highly dangerous and perhaps impossible feat. But when madness and death are the only other options, even the faintest chance shines like a beacon in the dark. And so I pour my fighting heart into this final Hail Mary, knowing it will either save me or seal my grim fate forever. According to legend, the key to breaking the Wendigo's curse lies in confronting the creature directly and destroying its earthly form. Only by driving your own hand through its heart can you hope to sever its malevolent tether and purge its evil influence from your soul. It's a task that seems not only daunting, but outright suicidal. After my previous encounter with the Wendigo, I am intimately aware of its superhuman strength and savagery. The chances of a mere human overpowering it long enough to land a killing blow are virtually non-existent. But at this point, what do I have to lose? I'm already as good as doomed. My humanity hangs by a thread, while I'm racked with monstrous urges I barely keep at bay. I'll be damned if I go down without a fight attempting to banish the evil consuming me from the inside out. So I've been preparing for my last stand, both mentally and physically. I've pored over topographical maps of the forest, searching for the most likely location of a creature that size. I've collected every scrap of iron, fire poker, tent stakes, old railroad spikes unearthed by erosion. Knowing the lore says the Wendigo cannot abide the touch of that particular metal. But perhaps most crucially, I've been steeling myself for the horrific maneuvers the task will require. Visualizing driving an iron spike through the heart of a living thing, feeling hot blood spurting over my hands, hearing the wet crunch of shattering bone and tearing flesh. As much as the gruesome mental image makes bile rise in my throat, I know hesitation in the pivotal moment could mean the difference between salvation and annihilation. The waiting has been its own exquisite torture, each day an exercise in white-knuckled restraint, while the Wendigo's influence claws at the edges of my mind. But tonight, fate has forced my hand. The hunger gnawing at my belly has grown from a dull ache to a ravenous black hole that food can no longer touch. Visions of gore and viscera dance behind my eyelids even in my waking moments. I feel the corruption of the Wendigo spirit eroding my humanity with every passing hour. I can no longer trust my own senses or my own mind. The line between man and monster blurs more with each new violent impulse surging through my psyche. And so, with an icy, single-minded resolve, I prepare for my last desperate bid for salvation. I methodically pack my bag with iron implements that may give me the slightest chance against supernatural evil, the fire poker, its solid weight anchored to sanity, railroad spikes, and tent stakes, crudely sharpened to wicked points. As dusk falls, I shoulder my pack and set out into the darkening woods, guided by both instinct and the scant clues I've been able to glean about the Wendigo's hunting patterns. My heart pounds a staccato rhythm against my ribs as the shadows lengthen and deepen. The dying sun paints the forest in eerie shades of crimson, as if foreshadowing the blood that will soon be spilled. Each rustle of leaves, each lonesome bird call sets my nerves jangling with hypervigilant dread. I know the creature is out there watching, waiting, perhaps savoring the scent of its next meal as I wander into its killing grounds. But even more chilling is the part of me that wants to be caught, wants to feel flesh give way beneath rending claws, to feast on steaming entrails and slick glistening bone, to surrender fully to the seductive promise of sating the bottomless hunger. I grit my teeth and tighten my grip on an iron spike until my knuckles turn white, forcibly dispelling the perverse fantasy. The dense foliage abruptly parts into a clearing that pricks the hairs on the back of my neck. It reminds of a structure little more than crumbling foundations, choked with creeping moss and vines jut like blackened teeth from the forest floor. The stench of rotten old blood taints the air, thick enough to coat the back of my throat with each breath. I've stumbled onto the Wendigo's lair. No sooner does that realization congeal in my gut than a piercing shriek shatters the sepulchral silence. It echoes from the trees at the clearing's edge, a sound of fury and horrible hunger. Then the creature is hurtling into the open, a nightmarish blur of matted fur, glistening fangs, and hellfire eyes. Time seems to slow to a terrible crawl as the Wendigo lunges. My muscles lock with fear even as my brain screams to move, run, or fight. I fumble for my weapons with numb fingers as the stench of its fetid breath washes over me. In an instant, it's on me. Its massive bulk bears me to the ground. I feel the shocking heat of my own blood shooting down my side as wickedly curved claws open gashes in my flesh. I scream an animal sound of pain and desperation as I grapple against the monster's titanic strength. Miraculously, my groping fingers close around the cool length of the iron fire poker strapped to my pack. With a burst of panic strength, I rammed the poker into the Wendigo's gaping maw. The creature reared back with a shrill howl, black ichor gushing from its jaws. In the moment it recoiled, I snatched a sharpened railroad spike from my belt and plunged it into the Wendigo's chest with every ounce of force I could muster. A wet, crunching squelch, a spray of dark arterial blood. The Wendigo staggered, its claws scrabbling at the iron protruding obscenely from its chest. I twisted the spike deeper, feeling the resistance of bone and gristle, and finally, horribly, the bursting give of the creature's heart rupturing. With a keening wail, the Wendigo crumpled its massive form, shuddering once, twice, before going terribly still. As I watched, its body seemed to shrivel, desiccating before my eyes until all that remained was a hideous, shrunken husk. The stink of death bloomed thick and heavy in the air. Through the pounding of my own heart and the roaring static in my ears, I registered a growing sense of lightness. As if some immense psychic weight had lifted, the gibbering whispers in my mind went silent, the unholy hunger banking to fading embers. With shaking hands, I pulled the radio from my pack, barely able to form the words to call for help and summon the rangers to my location. Shock, pain, and exhausted relief pulled me toward unconsciousness, even as I heard the crackle of a response, the promise of rescue. As the world dissolved into merciful darkness, one final lucid thought crystallized. I am myself again, battered and broken, but triumphantly human. I have won my salvation from the abyss and the evil that dwells in it. The Wendigo is dead. I begin to piece my life back together in the aftermath of the nightmare. Being rescued from the forest clearing more dead than alive is a memory that will haunt me forever. After my harrowing confrontation with the Wendigo, I was a shattered husk, physically ravaged by vicious wounds, mentally splintered by incomprehensible trauma and horror. I spent weeks in the hospital, healing in both body and mind. I endured countless surgeries to repair the damage left by the creature's talons, scars, and now I will carry for the rest of my life. But even more intensive was the psychological recovery process as I grappled with the impossible reality of what I'd survived. There were many nights I woke up screaming, drenched in cold sweat, still trapped in vivid dreams of blood and viscera and hellish red eyes. Days when the slightest noise, the briefest flash of shadow sent me spiraling into terror, convinced the monster had somehow returned to reclaim me. Post-traumatic stress. The therapist reassured me a natural response to a deeply scarring experience. But how could I make them understand the true depths of the horror I'd faced? That my ordeal hadn't just been an animal attack, but a brush with ancient malevolent evil that existed beyond the bounds of their textbooks. I found some solace in intensive trauma counseling and the solidarity of swapping survival stories with the rangers who helped rescue me. But I knew a part of me will always be lost to the abyssal hunger I glimpsed through its eyes when it was present. Even with the curse lifted, I still feel the echoes of its insidious corruption in the darkest corners of my psyche. As I healed physically, I made the difficult decision not to return to my ranger post. The wounds on my body would mend, but I knew my love affair with those deep dark woods was over. What was once a sanctuary now felt contaminated by the evil that lurked in its shadows. Confronting the Wendigo again, however remote the chances, was a risk I simply couldn't bear to take. So I turned in my badge and retreated home to Michigan. Haunted, but alive. I threw myself into my recovery, rebuilding some semblance of a life from the ashes of the old. I took a part-time job at a local nature center, trying to recapture my love of the outdoors. In carefully curated gardens and manicured trails, a far cry from untamed wilderness. Slowly, painfully, I began to heal. To wake up in the morning without feeling the phantom of its claws rending my flesh. To walk in the sun without seeing flickers of blood and viscera from the corners of my eyes. A little progress each day, stringing together in tiny victories, that even as the trauma scabbed over, the questions continued to fester. Why had it chosen me? Marked me for possession out of all the prey in those woods. What cosmic luck or nefarious design had spared me from its jaws, while condemning others to a gruesome fate? And perhaps most chilling is I truly free. Or did some tainted fragment of the evil still lurk like a cancer in my bones, waiting for a moment of weakness to metastasize? The aftermath of survival is often messier and more complicated than the neatly tied bow we imagine in stories. I may have driven out the residing evil, but the stain of its touch indelibly remained. And so I move forward the only way I can, one hopeful, brittle step at a time, forever glancing over my shoulder at the shadows nipping my heels. It's been 5 years since that fateful night in Huatha, when I stared into the face of an ancient evil and somehow lived to tell the tale. Half a decade to try and stitch my fractured life back together, to shape the broken pieces into some new mosaic of meaning. On the surface, things have stabilized. My terrors slowly faded from a nightly horror show to an occasional macabre rerun. Scars on my body, while permanent, have softened from livid slashes to faint silvery reminders. I even found the courage to return to park rangering, though in the carefully maintained safety of a city park, a world away from the untamed wilderness that nearly consumed me. But even as I move through the motions of a life rebuilt, an unshakable sense of unease persists, like the musty chill of the grave clinging to my bones. Because I know in the darkest recesses of my mind that my dance with the Wendigo isn't truly done. The signs began subtly, almost unnoticeably, beneath the background noise of trauma and recovery. A sharpness to sounds and smells that felt off, just heightened enough to tug at the edges of normalcy. A gnawing ache in my belly that food couldn't quite quench. Flavors gone bland and unsatisfying on my tongue. Unbidden urges rising like bile at the sight of a bloodied scrape or oozing wound. I dismissed them at first, some residual symptom of psychological scarring. But in the dark of night, in the naked honesty of my own mind, the truth is inescapably clear. Destroying the Wendigo's physical form wasn't enough. Like a supernatural tapeworm, a seedling of its essence still writhes inside me, inexorably growing as it feeds on the marrow of my soul. The lore never mentioned this, never spoke of the possession persisting beyond the monster's death. Perhaps no victim ever survived their encounter to learn the awful truth, or perhaps none wanted to acknowledge the creeping, excruciating corruption still blackening their spirit. To admit that the only escape from the Wendigo is a permanent one, and so I've spent the past few months in desperate research, scouring arcane texts and consulting obscure occult scholars, chasing the thinnest slivers of hope for a true reclamation of my humanity. But the outlook is bleaker than I can bear. The curse, once rooted, can only be severed one way, a full obliteration of the host before the final transformation takes hold. The signs are unmistakable, now impossible to rationalize. A sickly gray tinge creeps across my flesh. An electric ache builds in jaws and fingertips as teeth and nails yearn to sharpen. The way the ghost of an iron sting lingers where metal touches my skin. And most damnably, the hunger, the all-consuming void gluttonously swelling in my core, demanding a sacrifice of flesh and blood and viscera to sate its deepening depravity. I can feel myself teetering at the precipice of no return. In the dwindling corner of my psyche, where a fragment of untainted humanity still resides, I know what I must do to spare the innocent from the unthinkable carnage that looms. I've started giving away my possessions, settling my meager affairs as surreptitiously as I can manage. To anyone watching, I hope it looks like spontaneous generosity rather than the tying off of loose ends. Because if all goes as planned, there will be nothing left to inherit. I pen this final record not for my own sake, but as a warning to any who might stumble across my story and recognize a terrible resonance in their own life. If you too have gazed into the Wendigo's scarlet eyes and felt the icy caress of its corruption on your soul, you must not hesitate. You must be willing to do what it takes to break its grasp for good, even unto death, before it's too late for all of us. In these last tenuous hours, I find my thoughts turning to those halcyon days in the woods when the forest still felt like a sanctuary rather than a graveyard. The sun dappled paths in sweet, loamy air, the timeless magic of a cathedral green. I want to remember that beauty, that peace, even as I steel myself to relinquish everything in this last bitter fight for my soul. I cannot say I am unafraid, but there is a battered scrap of solace in knowing I won't face this dark alone. The creature within me may howl and thrash in its final moments, but it will be my own hands around its neck, my own will driving us into oblivion together. A grim mirror of that blood-soaked night 5 years ago. But this time I know, only one of us will emerge. And so, with this final record, I consign my story to chance and fate.